There was a time before cities, before language as we know it, before history had words for grief, and yet somewhere in the deep prehistoric dark, a human being may have felt something hauntingly familiar for the very first time: the pain of someone missing. Not hunger, not fear, but loneliness. The moment absence stopped being just danger and became emotion. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because tonight we're going back to the hidden beginning of human feeling itself. The first loneliness does not arrive in a city, or in a monastery, or in a room behind a locked door. It arrives much earlier, before walls, before writing, before history learns how to keep track of sorrow. It comes out on an open plain where the wind moves through coarse grass under a pale sky, and a single human being lingers just a little too far from the others. The distance is not great, a few ridges, a stand of stone, the fading line of smoke from a fire that can no longer be seen. Yet something irreversible has already happened in that distance. This is not simply the old animal fear of being exposed. It is not only the sharp instinct that says a body alone is easier to kill. Something else is gathering around the edges of the mind. A new kind of absence, a new awareness of separation, a feeling with no name yet, no ritual to contain it, no story to explain it. Only the long realization that the world has gone quiet where familiar voices should be. For most of life on Earth, to be cut off is a practical problem. The lost animal searches for the herd because the herd means safety. The abandoned infant cries because warmth and milk are elsewhere. Separation has always mattered. It matters to wolves, to elephants, to apes, to birds that wheel over cold seas and return to the same nesting ground year after year. But somewhere in the human past, separation begins to deepen into something stranger. It stops being only immediate and becomes inward. It begins to involve memory. It begins to involve expectation. A human being does not merely register that others are gone. A human being starts to feel the shape of who should be there. The empty place itself becomes heavy. That change is one of the most hidden turning points in the whole human story, because it leaves no single clear fossil behind. No bone carries a label saying this individual once sat awake by a dying fire and felt the full emotional weight of another person's absence. No cave floor preserves the first private ache of a mind realizing it is not enough, by itself, against silence. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how far back such inward emotional life can reasonably be traced. Yet what survives in the record suggests that something profound is already underway deep in prehistory. Long before literature describes sorrow, long before philosophy tries to define the self, human beings are already becoming creatures who can suffer not only from danger, hunger, or pain, but from separation itself. This transformation does not happen all at once. It emerges slowly, over immense spans of time, inside bodies and brains being altered by cooperation, by child-rearing, by memory, by language in its earliest forms, and by the endless pressure of having to survive together. The human story is not a story of isolated geniuses dragging civilization forward by force of mind. It is the opposite. It is the story of an animal that becomes unusually dependent on others, a creature too slow to outrun many predators, too weak to dominate most landscapes alone, too burdened by its own long childhood to survive without sustained care. Humans endure because they gather, because they share attention, because they read faces, because they remember who helped them, because they panic when bonds fray. They become powerful not in spite of dependence, but because of it. And once dependence becomes central, emotional exposure follows. The cost of social life rises with its importance. The more a creature requires others, the more dangerous their absence becomes. At first, that danger is practical. No companions means fewer eyes watching the horizon. No kin means no one to carry food, protect the young, share warmth, teach roots, recognize threats. But practical danger alone does not fully explain the emotional depth humans later show toward loss and separation. No single explanation fully accounts for this. Yet the best evidence points toward a slow intensification of inner life. Memory grows more layered. Anticipation stretches further into the future. Awareness of the self becomes more stable. The mind begins not only to react, but to revisit, compare, and imagine. At that point, absence changes. It is no longer just the lack of bodies nearby. It becomes the presence of what is missing. Imagine a Pleistocene evening in a cold corridor of land between ice and steppe. The light is draining fast. A small group has spent the day moving, watching, carrying, listening. Their world is dense with signs most modern people would miss entirely. Tracks softened by old snow, the angle of distant birds, the smell of wet fur, the changed sound of wind over stone. They know, almost without thinking, where the others are supposed to be. The group is not just a collection of bodies, it is an arrangement of expectation. One person scouts ahead, another keeps near the children, another lags for firewood, another has a particular gait, a particular cough, a particular way of calling out in warning. To belong to such a band is to live inside a woven pattern of presences so familiar that they fade into the background of perception, until one strand is gone. That may be the beginning of loneliness in its deepest human sense, not simply being alone, but noticing the torn pattern. The animal body still reacts first. Heart rate rises, muscles tighten, attention sharpens, yet the developing human mind adds another layer. It remembers yesterday. It compares the present with what should be. It projects forward into the next hour and finds no relief there. Absence becomes structured, and once it is structured, it begins to ache. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, there is a temptation to imagine early humans as emotionally blunt because their lives are so hard. It is an old mistake. Hardship does not simplify feeling. In many cases, it sharpens it. People living close to danger often become more sensitive to one another, not less. On a difficult landscape, every bond matters. Every quarrel has consequences. Every death changes the balance of survival. Even among recent hunter-gatherer societies observed by anthropologists, social ties are not incidental features of life, but the framework that makes life possible. Care is distributed, knowledge is distributed, emotional reassurance is distributed, food, labor, childcare, memory, and risk move through the group. A person alone is not merely unsupported. A person alone is, in a profound sense, displaced from the system that makes them human. That is why the hidden beginning of loneliness is likely bound to one of humanity's greatest evolutionary achievements, the ability to live in minds that are linked. Humans become extraordinarily skilled at shared attention. They point things out, they infer intention, they detect subtle changes in mood, they coordinate not only through movement but through expectation. Some researchers see this as the foundation of a language, morality, and culture itself. But it also has a shadow. The more finely tuned the social mind becomes, the more acutely it can feel disconnection. A creature that barely represents the inner lives of others cannot miss them in the same way. A creature that can imagine another person's thoughts, remember their habits, anticipate their return, and feel itself reflected in their gaze is vulnerable to a far deeper kind of absence. This may be why the first true loneliness has less to do with geography than with cognition. Physical solitude is ancient. Reflective solitude is different. There were surely hominins wandering or foraging beyond the immediate cluster of companions for millions of years. But when does that solitude become psychological? When does a being begin to feel not just exposed, but existentially cut off? Scholars still debate where along the human line this threshold appears. It may not belong to modern humans alone. Neanderthals, with their large brains, close care for the injured, and possible mortuary practices, may also have crossed part of that emotional frontier. The evidence does not allow certainty. Still, by the time Homo sapiens begins spreading across varied and often brutal landscapes, the ingredients are present social dependence, enduring attachment, symbolic thought, and a mind increasingly capable of turning inward. One lesser-known clue comes not from grand monuments or famous burials, but from the sheer length of human childhood. Human children are unusually helpless for unusually long periods. That fact reshapes everything. It requires extensive care, not just from mothers, but often from siblings, fathers, grandparents, and the wider group. It creates deep attachment because attachment is not optional. It is a survival technology. But technologies have side effects. A child whose mind is built to seek faces, voices, touch, and reassuring patterns does not simply notice their disappearance. The child experiences distress that is both bodily and emotional. Over evolutionary time, the architecture of attachment grows stronger because it works. Those who stayed close survived more often. Those who panicked at separation were not weak. They were responsive to a real threat. What begins as attachment behavior in infancy may, much later, open into the adult ability to feel loneliness with almost unbearable clarity. This is one reason loneliness is so difficult to trace yet so plausible as an ancient human emotion. It likely does not appear first as a dramatic adult revelation. It begins in the body's dependence on connection, in the infant carried against warmth, in the child waking in the dark and finding the familiar shape missing, in the adolescent aware of exclusion, in the injured hunter hearing the group move on ahead, in the old woman outliving those whose movements once structured every day. Loneliness, in that sense, may not be one emotion but a family of related experiences, all rooted in the same truth: the human nervous system expects companionship because it evolved inside it. And yet there is something else in the human version that exceeds biology. It is the mind's ability to turn absence into meaning. An ape may distress when separated. A human can sit beside a hearth and understand, however dimly at first, that someone who shared this place yesterday will never sit there again. A human can feel the persistence of that fact, can revisit it, can make it part of identity. This is where loneliness begins to approach grief, memory, and self-awareness all at once. It is no longer merely a signal urging reunion, it becomes a condition of consciousness. A person can be surrounded by others and still feel the silent outline of someone missing. That subtlety is hard enough to describe even now. In prehistory, it would have existed without explanation, embedded in life long before anyone possessed words abstract enough to name it cleanly. So the hidden beginning of human emotion may not lie in a sudden awakening, but in a gradual and painful enrichment of perception. To become more human is not only to become smarter, more cooperative, or more inventive, it is also to become more exposed to absence. The same capacities that allow planning, compassion, symbolism, and shared memory also allow emptiness to deepen. The same mind that can imagine a future camp, a successful hunt, or a distant season can imagine who is not here, and might never be here again. With that ability, the emotional world expands. It becomes richer, but also more dangerous. In the long prehistoric dark, this change would have gone unnoticed by the record and unforgettable to the people living through it. No elder would have announced that a new feeling had entered the human condition. No firelit gathering would have paused to mark the invention of inward sorrow. It would simply have happened, again and again, in small moments at the edges of survival. A delayed return, a sleeping place left empty, tracks diverging, a child calling into darkness, a widow carrying on inside the same migrating band, a young hunter learning that fear is easier to master than silence. Across thousands of generations, these moments accumulate. They shape the nervous system, they shape ritual, they shape memory. They begin to shape what it means to have a self at all. And that may be the strangest part of the story. Loneliness is often imagined as the failure of connection, a flaw in social life, a sign that something has gone wrong. But at its deepest origin, it may be evidence of the opposite. It may be proof of how thoroughly human beings came to belong to one another. The first person who truly felt loneliness was likely not the first to be alone. They were the first to understand, in however dim and wordless a way, that being apart could wound the mind because the mind had already been built in the image of others. Human emotion begins to change forever at that point. The landscape remains harsh, the night remains cold, predators still move at the edges of sight. But now another force enters the story, the interior shadow cast when social creatures become reflective creatures, and absence becomes something felt not only in the body, but in the soul's earliest and most fragile outline. What makes that first loneliness possible is not only the growing depth of the individual mind, but the kind of world human beings have already built around one another long before cities or kingdoms exist. Early human life is not a sequence of lone heroic struggles against nature. It is communal almost by necessity, woven from constant proximity, shared risk, and practical dependence so complete that separation can never be a neutral condition. A human band on the move across Pleistocene grassland, forest margin, river valley, or cold open steppe does not survive because each member is independently strong. It survives because attention is pooled. Someone notices the weather changing. Someone remembers where water held last season. Someone hears an animal moving where others hear only wind. Someone knows which roots are safe, which stone fractures well, which distant ridge offers shelter, which wound is likely to kill if left untreated. Knowledge is scattered among people and gathered through trust. No individual contains enough of the world alone. That is one of the great facts of human prehistory, and one that modern life can easily obscure. For most of human existence, survival is collective long before it is personal. The solitary body is real, but it is never sufficient. Food may be gathered by small parties and hunted by coordinated effort, yet eating itself depends on a social system of transport, sharing, and obligation. Fire must be maintained, children must be carried. The injured must sometimes be supported at cost to the rest. Camps are watched, materials are exchanged, routes are taught, reputation matters because memory matters. In such a life, presence is not merely comforting, presence is infrastructure. This has consequences far beyond practical cooperation. It means the human nervous system evolves in an environment where other people are not occasional additions to experience, but part of the baseline structure of reality, the face of another person, the sound of movement near the fire, the familiar rhythm of tasks being done nearby. All of this becomes part of what normal life feels like. Silence, then, is not simply silence. It is an interruption of expected pattern. Emptiness is not empty. It is charged with missing function, missing reassurance, missing recognition. Even rest is social. People sleep close for warmth, safety, and continuity. To wake and find distance where closeness should be is to waken to alarm. Anthropologists studying more recent foraging societies, however imperfectly such observations can be used as windows into the distant past, often emphasize how densely social everyday life tends to be. People do not disappear into private rooms. Work is visible. Conflict is visible. Affection is visible. Children circulate among caregivers. Elders are repositories not only of memory but of place. The band is not a vague group identity. It is the lived texture of each day. That does not mean such communities are idealized worlds of perpetual harmony. Quite the opposite. Tension, jealousy, irritation, exclusion, and fatigue all exist there as they do anywhere humans gather. But even conflict proves the same point. The emotional intensity of small group life arises because each person matters so much. In a tiny social world, there is no true anonymity. A harsh word lingers. A small kindness can be remembered for years. A departure alters the chemistry of the whole group. The size of these groups matters. For long stretches of prehistory, humans likely live in bands small enough for each member to be known as a distinct person, rather than a category, not a crowd, not a population, but recognizable individuals with habits, strengths, weaknesses, and roles that shift with age, season, and circumstance. One carries embers carefully. One is unusually patient with children. One is reckless in the hunt. One walks with an old injury and still knows the route through broken hills better than anyone else. One remembers the time the river failed. One can read weather from clouds that seem meaningless to younger eyes. In such settings, attachment is particular. People are not interchangeable units of sociality. They are themselves, and their absence leaves differently shaped gaps. That particularity may be essential to the history of loneliness. A creature can be social without becoming attached to individuals in the deeply layered human way. But the more human life depends on long memory and repeated association, the more specific those bonds become. This person should be here. That laugh should follow the shared meal. Those footsteps should sound at dusk. Once the mind expects people not just as bodies, but as distinct continuities, the emotional cost of separation changes. The band is still the unit of survival, but within it each tie develops its own weight. The loss of anyone is not just numerical, it is atmospheric. The evidence for care in prehistory reinforces this picture. Some ancient skeletons show signs of severe injury or disability followed by long survival, suggesting that others helped them endure when they could not easily fend for themselves. Scholars still debate how much can safely be inferred from individual cases, and no single specimen can bear too much emotional interpretation. Still, what survives in the record suggests that care is not a late luxury of civilization. It is ancient. In some cases, people live for years with impairments that would have made solitary existence nearly impossible. That means feeding, protection, tolerance, and adaptation by others. It means human groups are not only cooperative in the abstract, they are willing, at least sometimes, to sustain members who cannot repay that support in immediate practical terms. Once that threshold is crossed, the social world becomes morally and emotionally thicker. Care creates expectation. Expectation creates attachment. Attachment creates vulnerability. This is not sentimentality imposed on the past. It is the likely cost of long dependence. To be helped repeatedly is to be tied into a network of memory and feeling. To help repeatedly is the same. The person who survives because others carried them through a winter is not merely alive. They are embedded in debt. Gratitude, recognition, and bond. If one of those caregivers disappears, the practical loss and the emotional loss cannot be cleanly separated. Each intensifies the other. There is also the matter of synchronization, a quieter but equally important feature of human group life. People living together tend to regulate one another constantly. They match pace, gesture, vigilance, work rhythm, and rest. They eat at related times, rise in relation to the same light, react to the same sounds, and orient toward the same dangers. This kind of coordination reduces effort and enhances survival, but it also shapes the body's sense of normalcy. A person living within such synchrony becomes accustomed to being calibrated by others. Modern neuroscience would later show how strongly human beings respond to faces, voices, eye contact, touch, and predictable social presence. But the roots of that responsiveness are likely very old. The body settles differently among trusted others. It scans differently when alone. That is one reason loneliness is not just an idea. It is physiological. The first humans to feel it are likely also feeling changes in heartbeat, stress, sleep, and attention. Alone, the body remains on guard longer. Threat detection sharpens. Rest becomes thinner. Memory may even become more fixated on social cues because reunion is urgent. What begins as a useful alarm system can become a heavy inner state once the mind is developed enough to dwell on separation, instead of simply reacting to it. In that sense, band life does not merely create the possibility of belonging. It creates the machinery by which non-belonging can become painful. A lesser known and revealing detail is how much human foraging life likely depends on delayed returns. Not everyone remains in one visible cluster all day. Small hunting parties go out, gatherers spread, scouts move ahead, adolescents drift toward the edge of the group's supervision. Someone leaves to collect fuel or inspect tracks or follow signs beyond the day's main activity. These departures are ordinary, but they depend on trust in return. The band functions because temporary absence remains framed by expectation of reunion. People leave, and people come back. It is this rhythm that may quietly sharpen the emotional sense of loss when the rhythm fails. If return is the normal pattern, then non-return carries special force. At first it may be interpreted as delay, then as danger, then, eventually, as something worse. Loneliness grows in the interval between these recognitions. This also means early humans live inside a constant emotional tension between necessary independence and necessary connection. No one can survive if every step requires hand-holding. People must venture, risk, and sometimes endure brief solitude. But total detachment is equally impossible. The band requires competence in both domains, moving out and returning in, acting alone for a time while never ceasing to belong. That balance may be one of the deepest structures of human psychology. Even now, people often want autonomy without severance, privacy without abandonment, solitude without exclusion. The ancient pattern is still visible. To leave safely, one must know there is a place to come back to. And this is where the darker side of communal life emerges. The band protects, but it also judges. Inclusion is never automatic once humans become sufficiently social and self-aware. Reputation matters because others remember. Cooperation depends not only on affection but on trustworthiness, usefulness, restraint, and the management of conflict. A person who lies, hoards, threatens children, disrupts fragile peace, or repeatedly endangers the group may face anger or distance. The evidence for explicit social punishment in deep prehistory is hard to pin down, but among small-scale societies, exclusion is one of the harshest imaginable outcomes. That is not an accident. In a world where belonging is the primary condition of survival, being ignored, driven off, or quietly left behind is not only materially dangerous, it is psychologically devastating. The human mind learns early that connection is not guaranteed. It must be maintained. This helps explain why loneliness is so powerful, even when no one has physically vanished forever. Sometimes it arises in the middle of others. A person can be present in camp, yet feel cut off by disgrace, grief, suspicion, or altered status. An injury can do it. Infertility can do it. Age can do it. The death of a close companion can do it even when the rest of the group remains. The band is still there, but one crucial thread is gone or frayed. What survives in the record suggests that social life in prehistory is intimate enough to make these shifts deeply consequential, even if archaeology can only catch their outline in indirect ways. By now the human band has become more than an alliance against predators and hunger. It is an emotional habitat. The mind grows inside it. Identity grows inside it. The first stable sense of self may even depend on it, because other people do not merely help an individual survive, they reflect that individual back to themselves. A child discovers what kind of being they are through response. An adult confirms competence, affection, rank, and memory through the eyes of others. Remove that mirror, and the self becomes less steady. No single explanation fully accounts for how early this process matures, but the logic is hard to escape. The more thoroughly humans become social creatures, the less possible it is for aloneness to remain a simple physical fact. It becomes existential because the self has been built relationally from the start. So the life inside the human band creates the conditions in which loneliness can become one of the defining burdens of the species. Not because early humans are weak, and not because they lack resilience, but because they are resilient together. Their strength is distributed. Their knowledge is distributed. Their emotional equilibrium is distributed. A lone human on an ancient landscape is not only missing assistance, they're missing the living network that gives rhythm, reassurance, identity, and meaning to each day. The first loneliness takes shape in that recognition. It is born not from a failure to adapt to social life, but from adapting to it so completely that separation begins to feel like a wound to the organism itself. The human band creates the outer conditions for loneliness, but the feeling does not fully emerge until something changes inside the mind itself. A creature can depend on others, panic when separated, and still never experience absence in the distinctly human way. That deeper feeling requires more than attachment. It requires an inner world complex enough to hold what is no longer present. It requires memory that does not vanish when the scene changes. It requires anticipation that can move ahead of the body into possible futures. And it requires some early, unstable form of self-awareness. The sense that there is an inner witness carrying continuity from one moment into the next. When those capacities begin to thicken in the human story, absence becomes far more than a survival problem. It becomes a mental event with depth, duration, and reflection. It becomes something a person can inhabit. This is one of the strangest thresholds in prehistory because it cannot be excavated as neatly as a hearth or a blade. Archaeology can recover pigments, bones, hearths, shell beads, cut marks, campsites, and burials. It can show movement across landscapes, diet, injury, adaptation, and, sometimes, care. But the birth of an inward life has to be approached sideways. Scholars infer it from behavior, from symbolism, from planning depth, from the treatment of the dead, from the complexity of social coordination, and from the sheer developmental demands of the human brain. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how sudden or gradual this shift really is. Yet there is broad agreement on one essential point: the human mind did not simply become larger. It became more layered, and with every new layer, the emotional meaning of separation likely deepened. Memory is the first key, not memory in the simple sense of conditioned response, but episodic memory, the ability to revisit particular events, particular places, particular people. This capacity is difficult to measure in extinct humans, but what survives in the record suggests increasingly sophisticated planning and social learning over long timescales. People remember routes to distant resources. They return to certain landscapes. They transport valuable stone across considerable distances. They preserve tool traditions. They likely carry detailed mental maps not only of terrain but of social obligation. A mind capable of this is no longer living only in the present tense of stimulus and reaction. It can bring the absent into the present, and that is a dangerous gift. The remembered person is almost present enough to sharpen the fact that they are gone. Anticipation matters just as much. Humans do not merely remember what was, they project what should happen next. This individual will return by dusk. The group will move after the storm. The old path will lead to water. The child will wake and reach for the familiar body beside them. Expectation gives structure to life, but it also gives absence teeth. If the future one anticipates fails to arrive, the mind does not simply reset. It compares reality against an internal model. It experiences discrepancy. Over time, that discrepancy can become emotional pain. Loneliness may therefore depend not only on sociality, but on predictive consciousness. The more richly the mind models companionship, the more violently it can register its interruption. Then there is the question of self-awareness, the most elusive of all. At some point, humans begin to possess not just perception, but reflexive perception, not just experience, but the capacity to notice that they are the one experiencing it. There is no fossil for this. No skull opens to reveal the first unmistakably reflective thought. Yet signs of increasing symbolic behavior suggest a mind growing more capable of representing itself and its world. Handprints on cave walls are among the most haunting examples. A hand pressed into pigment is simple enough in one sense, but psychologically it is extraordinary. It is both presence and trace. I am here, and I am leaving evidence that I was here. Whether such marks express identity, ritual, affiliation, or something else, they hint at a mind able to objectify its own existence, to turn the self into a sign. That move may be essential to the history of loneliness, for loneliness is not just about missing others, it is also about becoming aware of oneself as a separate being who can stand apart from others. An animal immersed in immediate social life may feel distress when bonds are broken, but the human mind adds another dimension. It not only feels the lack of company, it recognizes itself as the one left to feel it. Separation becomes personal in a sharper way. The self does not dissolve into the environment. It remains intact enough to register its own isolation. This may be why loneliness often feels heavier than fear. Fear floods the system and demands action. Loneliness can remain still. It can sit beside a person and make them aware of their own inward boundaries. Language, or something approaching it, likely intensifies this shift even further. There is intense scholarly disagreement about exactly when language in its fully modern form emerges, and the evidence can only be indirect. But even before syntax becomes elaborate, increasingly sophisticated communication must have transformed human emotional life. Once people can refer to those not present, tell stories about past events, promise future reunion, or explain why someone has failed to return, absence ceases to be a mute condition. It enters shared thought. A person can be spoken of while gone. They can be remembered in words. They can be anticipated in words. And eventually they can be mourned in words. That does not lessen loneliness. In some cases it may deepen it, because language preserves what would otherwise fade. It gives shape to attachment beyond the moment of contact. A lesser known but revealing possibility lies in the human ability to simulate other minds. Social cognition does not stop at recognizing faces or reading immediate intention. Humans become remarkably skilled at carrying internal models of others, what someone knows, what they might do, what they tend to prefer, how they are likely to respond. This is part of what makes cooperation so powerful. Yet it also means that other people begin to live partly inside the mind even when physically absent. One can imagine their reaction, hear their voice inwardly, anticipate their displeasure, long for their return. Once this capacity matures, absence becomes crowded. The missing person is gone from the world and still active in thought. That paradox may be central to why loneliness feels so intimate and so difficult to resolve. The mind keeps company with what it cannot reach. This cognitive deepening probably does not occur in isolation from the body. The growing brain of Homo sapiens is metabolically expensive, developmentally prolonged, and extraordinarily plastic. Much of what makes human inner life possible comes from this long, vulnerable developmental arc. Children spend years depending on others not only for food and protection, but for regulation of attention, emotion, and meaning. They learn not simply how to survive, but how to inhabit a shared symbolic world. In the process, they internalize patterns of comfort and response. A face calms them. A familiar voice organizes distress. A known rhythm of care becomes the background against which experience makes sense. When that background breaks, the child does not only lose external support, the architecture of the self trembles. Scholars still debate how closely we can map such developmental realities onto deep prehistory. But the principle is persuasive. A mind formed through sustained interdependence is especially capable of suffering when interdependence fails. There may also be a darker consequence to expanded memory and self-awareness. Once humans can revisit the past and imagine the future, they are no longer limited to the actual duration of separation. They can suffer it in advance and relive it afterward. A hunter overdue by several hours may already be mentally mourned before certainty arrives. A dead child may remain present in dreams, habits, and involuntary expectation long after burial. The old sleeping place continues to glow in memory. The path once walked together becomes difficult to cross without emotional reaction. In this way, cognition lengthens loneliness. It stretches the wound across time. This is where the human emotional world becomes both richer and more fragile than anything strictly required by biology. The same mind that allows planning, teaching, tool innovation, and symbolic identity also creates the possibility of inward suffering that cannot be solved immediately by reunion. A person can remain lonely even in company, because what is missing is not generic social contact, but a particular continuity of recognition. The mind has become fine-grained enough to distinguish between bodies nearby and true emotional presence. No single explanation fully accounts for when this ability first stabilizes, but it is likely tied to the broader emergence of reflective thought. Humans begin to live not only among others, but among meanings. That shift may also help explain why solitude itself becomes ambiguous in human life. Once self-awareness matures, time alone is no longer only dangerous. It can also become cognitively fertile. A person apart from the group may remember more sharply, rehearse plans, revisit teachings, imagine the intentions of prey, or contemplate the dead. The same inwardness that makes loneliness possible also makes reflection possible. It opens the space for symbolism, spirituality, and narrative. But the benefits come with cost. To have an interior life is to have a place where absence can echo. Perhaps that is why the archaeological record begins, slowly and unevenly, to show signs of behavior that exceed immediate utility: pigment use, personal adornment, carefully shaped objects, repeated marking of certain spaces, and eventually art itself all suggest a creature doing more than meeting practical need. Such acts may signal identity, cohesion, ritual, status, or cosmology. They may also reveal a mind increasingly concerned with continuity across absence. A bead carried far from its source, a mark left on stone, a body placed deliberately in the ground, all imply that memory matters. They imply that what is not physically present can still be held, represented, or addressed. Loneliness belongs naturally to such a world, because it is one of the prices paid when symbols begin to preserve attachment beyond immediate contact. The birth of inner awareness, then, is not a single flash of consciousness in one dramatic moment. It is a long, uneven enrichment of the human mind, taking shape over hundreds of thousands of years through social dependence, memory, prediction, attachment, and symbolic thought. Somewhere within that enrichment, absence changes its nature. It stops being a temporary logistical problem and starts becoming an inward condition. A person can feel not only that others are gone, but that they themselves remain, carrying the silence. That may be the hidden beginning of loneliness in the fullest human sense. And once that threshold is crossed, the dead do not disappear cleanly either. They remain in expectation, in memory, in the shape of places once shared. A body may vanish from camp, but not from the social mind. This is where loneliness begins to lean towards something even deeper than separation in life. It begins to touch grief, because the mind that can remember and anticipate can also continue loving what will never return. In the long human past, that change will leave some of its clearest traces not in tools or bones alone, but in how the living begin to behave around the dead. The dead begin as a practical problem. A body can attract scavengers, it can contaminate water, it cannot travel under its own strength. In the earlier stretches of human prehistory, many deaths likely disappear into the landscape with little formal trace. Exposure, scavenging, weather, movement, and time erase most individuals completely. This is one reason the archaeological record is so uneven. Countless human losses leave almost nothing behind, yet at some point, and in different ways across different populations, the living start to do more than merely leave the dead where they fall. They return to them, they place them, they cover them, sometimes they decorate them, Sometimes they keep close to them in ways that no purely practical explanation can fully satisfy. What survives in the record suggests that by the later phases of the human story, death is no longer only an event of biological termination. It becomes a social rupture that demands response. This matters because loneliness deepens dramatically once absence becomes permanent. Temporary separation can still be organized by hope. The missing hunter may return, the foraging party may be delayed, the child who wandered may be found. Even exile, though brutal, leaves open the possibility of reappearance in imagination. Death closes that door, but the mind does not always accept the closure at once. A social creature whose inner world is built from repeated presences does not instantly adapt when one of those presences ends. The body may be still, the role may be vacant, yet expectation persists. A person wakes and, for a moment, still anticipates the familiar movement at the edge of camp. They hear a sound and attach the old identity to it. They begin to turn towards someone who is no longer there. That lag between reality and attachment is one of the oldest forms of grief, and perhaps one of the places where loneliness first becomes unmistakably human. Burial, when it appears, is therefore more than disposal. Scholars still debate many individual cases, and there are major disputes over which early finds represent deliberate funerary treatment and which are better explained by natural processes or ambiguous deposition. Caution matters here. Not every skeleton in a pit is evidence of ceremony. Not every cluster of grave goods means fully developed religion. Still, across parts of the Middle Paleolithic and later, there are strong signs that some human groups deliberately place bodies in ways that preserve them from immediate disturbance. Among both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, certain burials suggest intention bodies laid in prepared spaces, sometimes in flexed positions, sometimes associated with ochre, tools, ornaments, or animal remains. No single explanation fully accounts for every case, but what survives in the record suggests a shift in how the living understand the dead. The body's being treated as if the person still matters. That phrase matters. The person still matters. It may sound obvious from a modern perspective, but in evolutionary terms it is profound. A dead individual no longer hunts, gathers, teaches, carries, reproduces, or protects. Purely utilitarian logic would allow them to vanish from concern almost at once. Yet human beings often do the opposite. They invest effort in the dead. They risk time, energy, and sometimes safety to stay with a body, move it, conceal it, or mark its resting place. That implies not only attachment, but enduring attachment. The relationship does not stop exactly where respiration stops. Something in the human social mind continues to relate to the absent as if they remain meaningful beyond use. This may be one of the clearest windows into the emotional threshold described earlier. The birth of loneliness is not simply the sadness of being physically alone. It is the recognition that a bond can outlast contact, and even outlast life. Once that happens, absence is no longer temporary by default. It becomes a condition people must carry. The dead remain in memory, in roots once shared, in tasks once divided between two pairs of hands, in stories retold around the fire. And in the altered geometry of the living group, one sleeping place stays empty, one source of knowledge is gone, one child asks for someone who will not answer. In a small prehistoric band, death is never abstract. It changes everything immediately. It is demographic, practical, and emotional all at once. There is a revealing detail here that often receives less attention than spectacular grave finds. The scale of small group life means every death is proportionally enormous. In a village of thousands, one death is devastating to some and barely known to many. In a band of perhaps a few dozen people, the death of one adult can remove a major share of knowledge, labour, and social continuity. If the dead person is a skilled hunter, a mother, a healer, an elder with seasonal memory, or the centre of a particular cluster of attachments, their absence reshapes the group's daily function. The living do not merely mourn in private, they move through a social landscape permanently altered by one missing node. Loneliness, in such a context, is not a luxury emotion. It is the felt side of structural rupture. The possibility of mourning among archaic humans is therefore not a sentimental projection, but a serious question grounded in evidence of care and deliberate treatment. Neanderthals are central to this discussion because they appear, at least in some cases, to have buried their dead. The interpretation of famous sites has often shifted as methods improve and skepticism increases. Earlier claims about flower burial, for example, are now treated with more caution. Pollen can enter deposits in several ways, and romantic narratives have sometimes run ahead of evidence. Yet even stripped of embellishment, some Neanderthal contexts still suggest intentional placement, combined with evidence that injured or impaired individuals sometimes survived for long periods. A picture emerges of groups capable of sustained social concern. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points toward a world in which death is noticed not merely as loss of function, but as loss of personhood. Among Homo sapiens, the signals eventually become stronger and more varied. Burials with ochre, shell beads, tools, and other objects suggest that the dead are entering a symbolic domain. Ochre in particular has long fascinated archaeologists because of its repeated association with bodies and ritual contexts in many times and places. No single symbolic meaning can be assigned to it. It may evoke blood, transformation, warmth, identity, or something now unrecoverable. But its use implies intention beyond disposal. The body's being prepared, framed, or addressed. This in turn suggests that the living are not emotionally finished with the dead. They are doing something to keep a relationship legible across the boundary of death. And that may be where loneliness first acquires true duration. Separation in life can often be resolved by movement. Death cannot. The dead do not return to camp after a delayed hunt. They do not explain themselves. They do not resume their place in the ordinary rhythm of touch, speech, work, and glance. Yet the mind continues reaching toward them. This reach may produce some of humanity's earliest rituals, not because ancient people are naive about biology, but because attachment itself has momentum. A body in the ground may help the living begin to organize the shock. A marked place may give absence a location. A repeated gesture may keep memory from dissolving into chaos. Scholars still debate how much symbolic complexity should be attributed to early burials. But even minimal interpretation points to one clear fact: the dead are not being treated as nothing. This has consequences for the development of inner life. Once the dead remain socially present after biological death, the human world becomes crowded with absences that do not vanish. The past thickens. Memory becomes populated by people who are gone and still somehow active in the emotional landscape. A child can grow up hearing of someone they never met. An elder can continue structuring the group through remembered instruction after their body is gone. A widow or widower can keep behaving toward the missing person inwardly, long after practical life has moved on. The earliest forms of ancestor consciousness may emerge from this terrain, though the evidence for fully developed ancestral cults belongs much later and in more complex societies. In deep prehistory, what likely comes first is simpler and more piercing, the inability of the social mind to switch off attachment when death occurs. There is also the question of place. Some prehistoric groups return repeatedly to particular locations, and although many factors drive such returns, including resources and shelter, repeated use can also create emotional geography. A place remembers who was there. Even without built monuments, landscapes can become layered with presence and absence. The river crossing where someone drowned, the shelter where a child once slept, the ridge where an elder last pointed out the seasonal path. Modern grief often works this way, and there is good reason to think ancient grief did too. Humans are unusually capable of binding memory to location. Once that happens, loneliness no longer belongs only to moments of isolation. It can be triggered by the world itself. The land becomes an archive of missing people. One lesser known but important implication is that mourning may have strengthened group identity, even as it intensified individual pain. To bury, remember, or ritually address the dead is to affirm that the group extends across time, not just across living bodies. This creates continuity. It tells the living that they belong to a chain of persons, that those who vanish are not wholly erased, and that bonds can be recognized even after irreparable loss. Such practices may have helped soften loneliness by embedding it in collective memory, but they could not remove it. If anything, they may also have deepened it by keeping attachment vivid. A marked grave or a remembered rite is both comfort and wound. It says the person mattered, and it also says they are gone. The first humans to experience this fully would have entered a transformed emotional world. It is one thing to fear being left behind on a landscape full of predators. It is another to understand that someone central to one's life has crossed into a state no search party can reverse. That knowledge changes the structure of thought. It makes memory heavier. It enlarges the self by enlarging what the self must carry. Loneliness ceases to be only situational and becomes historical. A person's inner life can now include those who once were and no longer are. This is why grief and loneliness are so closely entwined in the human story. Grief gives loneliness permanence, and loneliness gives grief its quietest shape. No single burial tells us exactly what any individual felt. Archaeology cannot recover the private ache of the survivor who returned to a campfire one person short, or the child who learned to stop looking toward a familiar place. But the pattern across time is suggestive. The living continue to behave as though the dead require care, memory, and response. That implies a mind unable to reduce social bonds to immediate utility. It implies emotional continuity. It implies love, in however early and untheorized a form, and where love persists beyond death, loneliness becomes one of its shadows. So when the dead still remain, they remain not as ghosts in the supernatural sense, at least not yet in any reconstructible way, but as active absences inside the human mind. They remain in remembered movements, in objects once handled by specific hands, in paths walked together, in tasks now done alone. The first burials are therefore not only about death, they are about the living learning, perhaps for the first time, that the mind can continue to keep company with those it can no longer reach. That realization may have opened one of the deepest chambers of human emotion, and once opened, it would never close again. The night around the fire grows larger after that. The silence between sounds carries more weight. Darkness is no longer filled only with external danger. It is filled with the inward echo of those who should still be there. Darkness changes everything, and it changes it early. By day, the prehistoric world is difficult but legible. Distance can be judged. Tracks can be followed. Companions can be counted with a glance. The horizon speaks in visible forms. Herds move, weather gathers, smoke rises. Children remain within sight, and even danger, however sudden, usually enters through some perceivable sign. But when evening settles over Ice Age grassland or forest edge, certainty begins to contract. Colour drains first, then detail, then depth. The living world does not disappear in the dark. It only becomes harder to interpret, and therefore more powerful in the mind. A branch breaks somewhere beyond the glow of the fire. Wind presses through reeds. The ground that seemed familiar in daylight becomes a plain of hidden movement. The people nearest the flame remain visible, but beyond them the world opens into blackness. And in that blackness absence begins to feel larger than it does under the sun. This is one reason loneliness in early human life is unlikely to have been evenly distributed across time or setting. It would have had its landscapes, and it would have had its hours. Night is among the most important of them, not because darkness invents separation, but because it magnifies awareness of it. In daylight, a person missing from the group might still be searched for, tracked, expected, even seen returning from a distance. At night, the range of action narrows. The mind loses evidence and gains imagination. The person who has not returned by sunset now enters a different category of thought. Their delay can no longer be easily checked. Their path cannot be followed until morning. Their silence grows heavier because nothing in the dark can answer it. Scholars still debate how much emotional life can be read from environmental conditions alone, but it is hard to ignore how profoundly darkness alters the human nervous system. It has always been one of the oldest theatres of fear. For early humans, that fear is practical before it is symbolic. Large predators often move most effectively in low light. Cold intensifies after sunset. Orientation becomes difficult. Firelight protects, but only in a small circle. Beyond it, eyes and ears do more work than sight, and uncertainty multiplies. Yet once the human mind is sufficiently reflective, darkness acquires another function. It becomes an amplifier of interior experience. The same black horizon that conceals predators also invites memory, anticipation, and dread. A missing companion is harder to stop thinking about when all ordinary tasks have slowed and the group has drawn inward around the fire. The silence between small sounds stretches. Familiar presences matter more. An empty place at the edge of the light becomes almost unbearable because it is constantly visible and constantly unfilled. The fire itself is central here, not only as technology but as emotional architecture. Fire extends waking life beyond daylight. It allows people to remain gathered after useful labour is largely done. It creates a boundary between known and unknown, safety and exposure, warmth and cold, companionship and the outer dark. Some researchers have argued that firelit evenings may have helped deepen storytelling, teaching, bonding, and reflection. This is plausible. Around the fire, the social mind has room to dwell. The day's movements can be recounted, plans can be revised, the dead can be remembered, warnings can be retold, children can absorb the group's emotional tone, but such evenings would also sharpen every absence. Fire does not erase loneliness, it frames it. It makes visible exactly who has returned and who has not. A lesser-known point is that firelight distorts as much as it reveals. It turns faces into moving masks of brightness and shadow. It exaggerates motion. It leaves the background uncertain. Anyone who has sat awake by flame in open country knows how the mind begins to populate the margins. Shapes emerge and vanish. Distance loses stable form. In that environment, imagination is not an abstract luxury. It becomes a constant interpretive force. Something similar likely happened in prehistory. The human mind, increasingly capable of projection and narrative, would have found darkness especially fertile ground. A loved one overdue from a short excursion might be mentally transformed by the night into injury, attack, abandonment, or death. The evidence remains incomplete, but it strongly suggests that human cognition was never operating in a neutral perceptual field. It developed in worlds where uncertainty had atmosphere. This may help explain why loneliness often carries not just sadness but unease. It is bound to the ancient overlap between social separation and vulnerability in dangerous environments. To be alone at night on an Ice Age landscape is not merely emotionally difficult. It is physiologically dysregulating. The body remains vigilant. Sleep becomes shallow or impossible. Every sound is assessed as threat. In this state, the absent other is experienced twice over, once as emotional loss, and once as lost protection. The mind may understand these as one feeling. What later cultures will call loneliness may still, in its oldest form, be braided tightly with fear, not because it is reducible to fear, but because both arise from the same break in the protective human circle. Yet darkness does something more subtle too. It removes the visual chatter of the world and leaves the mind alone with continuities it cannot easily escape. Daylight is full of tasks. Night allows recurrence. A person can think of the dead again, of the missing, of the estranged, of the insult not answered, the child no longer sleeping nearby, the old companion whose role in the rhythm of camp remains painfully vacant. This is where loneliness becomes psychological in a fuller sense. It is no longer only a response to immediate separation. It is a condition sustained by repetition of thought. In the quiet after conversation fades, one can feel the full contour of who is not there. What survives in the record suggests that humans had, by deep prehistory, already become creatures of recurring memory. Night would have been one of the hours when that capacity pressed hardest. Cave spaces and rock shelters may have intensified this in different ways. Open camps expose people to darkness as a vast surrounding absence. Caves and shelters compress sound and shadow differently. Drips echo. Air shifts through unseen passages. Firelight catches on stone and vanishes abruptly into black recesses. In such places, closeness to others may feel stronger, but so may the sense of what lies beyond immediate perception. Later cave art suggests that some subterranean spaces acquire symbolic significance far beyond practical shelter, though many decorated caves are not domestic sites in any simple sense. Still, even ordinary shelter use would have shaped emotional experience. Darkness in enclosed spaces makes the unseen feel near, intimate, almost bodily. For a grieving or separated mind, that intimacy may have sharpened the sensation of missing presence. Silence in a cave does not feel empty. It feels inhabited by whatever thought brings into it. There is also the matter of stars, though not in the romantic modern sense. A clear prehistoric night sky would often have been astonishingly bright, more crowded with visible detail than most people today ever experience. That brilliance could orient, or unsettle. Long before formal astronomy, humans must have noticed regularity overhead, moving lights, fixed patterns, phases of the moon, seasonal changes in the sky. Scholars still debate how early symbolic associations with celestial phenomena become culturally stable, but simple awareness would have required no elaborate cosmology. Even so, The night sky may have contributed to loneliness in an indirect way. It makes the individual feel small. It places the firelit group beneath an immense order that remains indifferent to personal loss. In a world where one particular absence is tearing at the mind, the sheer scale above can either console or deepen the wound. No single explanation fully accounts for how early humans felt under the stars, but insignificance and wonder likely arrived together. Children would have experienced the darkness differently, and this matters. Human emotional life is not built first in adulthood, it is built in the rhythms of dependence. A child waking in darkness and reaching for reassurance encounters night as a test of attachment. If the familiar figure is present, fear settles. If not, distress intensifies quickly, over generations. Such repeated experiences may have helped wire the link between darkness and social need even more deeply into the human system. Night is when separation becomes harder to tolerate because sensory certainty is low and dependence becomes newly obvious. The adult who later sits awake feeling the full ache of loneliness may be drawing on emotional pathways first laid down in those much earlier moments of needing another body nearby to make the dark bearable. And still, there is a paradox here. The very same darkness that magnifies loneliness may also nourish the beginnings of myth, ritual, and shared meaning. Around the fire, the group can push back not only cold and predators, but chaos itself. Stories told at night do more than pass time. They organize fear. They connect individuals to group memory. They explain patterns, impose moral order, preserve names, and soften absence by making it part of a larger narrative. The evidence for formal storytelling in deep prehistory is necessarily indirect, yet language, memory, and evening social life strongly suggest that some form of narrative sharing is ancient. In that sense, loneliness may have helped drive one of humanity's most important cultural responses. The more painful absence became, the more necessary it was to bind people through story while they were still present. But stories do not eliminate the empty place beside the fire. They only make it speakable. The missing hunter, the dead mother, the companion taken by illness, the elder whose knowledge survives only in fragments carried by others, all remain absent in the simplest and hardest sense. Darkness gives that fact emotional weight. It slows the world down enough for the mind to feel it fully. It turns silence into a surface onto which longing can be projected. It makes every returning footstep a relief, and every continued delay a tightening of the chest. This is why night fires and empty darkness belong so centrally to the hidden beginning of human loneliness. The feeling does not arise in abstraction. It is shaped by real environments, by cold, by limited vision, by the reach of firelight, by the danger beyond camp, by the mind's deepening ability to remember and imagine. Loneliness under those conditions is not self-indulgence. It is what happens when a social yastur, reflective creature, sits at the threshold between protection and vast uncertainty, knowing exactly who should still be within the circle and who is not. By then, the emotional world of early humans has become unmistakably layered. They do not simply endure the landscape, they interpret it. They do not simply gather around the flame, they bring their absences there with them. And once darkness begins to do that work, to enlarge silence and sharpen missing presence, the next step becomes unavoidable. Loneliness is no longer only a fleeting sensation tied to the night. It can become a social wound in daylight too, especially when separation is not caused by chance or death, but by the harder realities of injury, exile, migration, or being left behind by one's own people. Not all separation in the ancient world comes from death, and not all loneliness is born in silence at the edge of the fire. Some of it arrives in motion, in pain, in the brutal arithmetic of survival. A body falls behind. A wound does not heal cleanly. A storm cuts one party off from another. A river changes course. A migration stretches too far. A quarrel hardens. Someone becomes difficult to trust. Someone becomes too weak to keep pace. Under such conditions, loneliness is no longer only the inward echo of missing presence. It becomes a direct consequence of the choices, limits, and losses that harsh landscapes force upon human groups. That may be the most uncomfortable part of this story. The same species that evolved to depend so deeply on connection also evolved in worlds where connection could not always be preserved. The prehistoric band is cooperative, but it is never free from constraint. Food runs short, winter closes in, children must be protected with whatever strength remains. The injured can sometimes be supported, but not always indefinitely. The elderly may retain immense value as memory holders and social anchors. Yet frailty still has costs. Infants are loved, but in some conditions they do not survive. No sentimental picture of ancient life can withstand the evidence of repeated crisis. Climate shifts, dangerous game, infection, accidents, and long-distance movement impose pressure that no group can fully escape. Under that pressure, separation can become a grim adaptation rather than a simple accident. Scholars still debate how often explicit abandonment occurred in deep prehistory. Because the record is fragmentary and motive is rarely visible. But what survives in the record suggests a world where survival sometimes narrowed the margin for care. That narrowing would have created some of the sharpest loneliness any human being could feel. Injury is one path into that condition. A person hurt away from camp may experience separation first as confusion, then as fear, then as the terrible realization that the ordinary rhythm of the group has continued without them. Even in cases where companions return or attempt rescue, the interval itself matters. The injured person must wait. Waiting is one of loneliness's oldest chambers. It stretches time and fills it with the mind's worst possibilities. The sound of others fades. Daylight changes. The body begins to understand its own vulnerability. A reflective human being in that position does not only feel pain, they feel the shrinking of the social world around them. The band that once gave rhythm and reassurance becomes memory, then hope, then, if no one returns, a wound more severe than the injury itself. This is likely one reason why evidence of care in the archaeological record feels so emotionally powerful. Skeletons showing survival after major trauma suggest that some people were not left to die when they might easily have been. A damaged limb, a healed fracture, severe tooth loss followed by continued life, all indicate periods in which other people slowed down, shared food, offered protection, and absorbed the cost of another's weakness. These finds are rightly treated with care, because each case has limits and interpretation must remain disciplined. Yet taken together, they imply that abandonment is not the whole story. Humans often carry one another, but that only sharpens the emotional stakes of the opposite outcome. If help is possible, being left behind becomes more than misfortune. It becomes social rupture. Migration intensifies this further. For much of human history, movement is not exceptional. It is ordinary. Groups follow animals, shift with seasons, respond to drought, retreat from ice, explore new corridors, or are forced onward by depleted local resources. Movement keeps people alive, but it also strains social bonds. The slower person becomes a problem. The sick child changes pace. The woman near childbirth changes pace. The old man who knows the valley behind them may not be suited to the climb ahead. Every migration contains unequal burdens. Even when a group remains intact, the stress of movement can produce a subtler loneliness, the loneliness of dislocation. A person does not only miss other people, they can miss the place where their relationships made sense, the old shelter, the remembered water source, the ridge where a dead relative once stood, all vanish behind the group as it moves. Absence then belongs not only to individuals, but to landscapes. This may be one of the first forms of homesickness, though the term is much later. A mobile people are not rootless in the shallow sense. They often know certain territories intimately, returning to them seasonally and carrying deep memory of where things happened. When such continuity breaks, emotional loss can follow. What survives in the record suggests that humans bind memory strongly to place. Repeated camps, enduring travel corridors, curated knowledge of resource zones, and later ritual returns all point toward landscape as more than terrain. It is social memory distributed across geography. To be cut off from it may produce a loneliness not fully resolved even in company. One can travel with the group and still feel severed from the world that once held the dead, the known paths, and the reassuring repetition of belonging. Exile, whether formal or informal, may have been even harsher. Small group societies depend on trust, reciprocity, and the management of conflict. No group can afford perpetual internal sabotage. A person who threatens children, hoards in famine, refuses obligations, behaves unpredictably in dangerous situations, or repeatedly violates fragile norms can become intolerable. The evidence for explicit expulsion in deep prehistory is almost impossible to isolate with certainty. Yet ethnographic comparison suggests that severe social sanction, including distancing and exclusion, has long been one of the strongest tools available to small human communities. That makes sense. In a world with limited formal institutions, belonging itself is the greatest protection. To lose it is to lose nearly everything. The emotional meaning of exile would have been catastrophic. Modern loneliness is often imagined as passive neglect, but in the ancient world it could arrive as judgment, to know not only that one is alone, but that one has been placed outside the human circle, is a different form of pain from bereavement or accidental separation. It wounds identity directly. The self that was once reflected back by familiar eyes now encounters refusal, distrust, or indifference. No single explanation fully accounts for how early humans processed this internally, but the logic of social cognition suggests deep injury. A relational mind cannot easily withstand relational rejection. Even now, social exclusion activates distress with a force that seems bodily because, in evolutionary terms, it always has been. A lesser known but revealing possibility is that loneliness in prehistory may often have been collective rather than purely individual. A group fractured by loss, conflict, or dispersal could experience something like shared loneliness. After a death, all remain together, and yet all feel the vacancy. After a migration, the band reaches new ground, and yet all sense what has been left behind. After a split, two daughter groups may survive and still carry the ache of severed kin ties. Humans are capable of communal grief, communal silence, communal disorientation. In this sense, loneliness is not always the feeling of one isolated body. It can be the atmosphere of a damaged social field. Children again reveal the structure most clearly. Separation for them is immediate, uncompromising, and total. A lost child on a prehistoric landscape is not only endangered but existentially unmoored. The people who regulate fear, provide warmth, interpret the world, and define reality have vanished from reach. The child's distress is therefore both biological and emotional in the most direct sense. But even less extreme experiences matter. A child whose mother dies, whose father fails to return, whose caregivers are absorbed by crisis, or who becomes subtly peripheral within the group may experience forms of loneliness long before abstract thought fully matures. These early separations likely leave marks on the developing nervous system, shaping expectations about safety and connection for years afterward. Scholars still debate how much psychological continuity can be inferred across such vast timescales. But the foundations of attachment are ancient enough that the pattern is difficult to ignore. There is also the loneliness of altered status. An injury that permanently changes someone's role in the group may isolate them, even if they remain physically included. The hunter who no longer joins the hunt. The woman who loses a child and returns to ordinary labour carrying an absence no one else can fully occupy. The elder whose knowledge is still respected but whose body can no longer travel as before. In small communities, identity is often deeply tied to function, and a change in function changes how others relate. This need not mean cruelty. It may simply mean that social life reorganizes, leaving some people emotionally stranded in plain sight. One can sit within arm's reach of others and still feel outside the movement of collective purpose. This possibility matters because it shows loneliness is not always resolved by proximity. By now the human mind is too layered for that. What it seeks is not only bodies nearby, but meaningful inclusion, recognition, and role. The exile lacks all of these. The bereaved lose them in one relationship. The injured may lose them in altered form. The migrant may lose them in relation to place. The abandoned lose them suddenly and completely. All of these conditions likely existed in some form deep in the human past, and each would have pressed the developing emotional system in different ways. Loneliness becomes not one thing, but a spectrum of wounds tied to the many ways social continuity can fail. And still, what is striking is that humans continue to organize life around preventing these failures whenever possible. They carry the injured, they slow for children, they remember the dead, they seek reunion, they maintain bonds across movement. They punish exclusion with seriousness because it matters so much. In evolutionary terms, this suggests that the cost of separation is high enough to shape behavior repeatedly. Loneliness is not incidental. It is one of the signals by which human beings learn what must be protected. Yet signals can overwhelm. A feeling built to warn a person back toward the group becomes unbearable when the group cannot be regained. That is the tragedy written into human social evolution. The same emotional systems that help keep fragile bands together can become instruments of suffering when nature, conflict, or necessity tears those bands apart. The first humans to experience exile, abandonment, or irreversible dislocation would have felt not merely fear but a more enduring break. The sense that the shared human field that once held them had moved beyond reach. By this point in the story, loneliness has become unmistakably more than solitude. It is bound to injury, migration, social judgment, status loss, and the hard decisions survival sometimes forces. It has moved from the edge of the fire into the daylight world of practical danger, and beneath all of it lies an even older structure, one formed long before adult grief or exile, the vulnerable architecture of attachment first built in infancy. When the absence of a caregiver is not a metaphor, but the original shape of fear itself, before loneliness becomes philosophical, before it becomes ritual, memory, exile, or the ache of the dead, it begins much closer to the skin. It begins in helplessness. It begins in the ordinary terror of separation, felt by a human child too young to survive alone and too unfinished to regulate its own fear. This is one of the oldest truths about the species. Human beings arrive in the world incomplete. Compared with many other animals, the human infant is astonishingly dependent, unable to move far, feed itself, protect itself, or make sense of danger without the constant organizing presence of others. That dependence is not a flaw in the design. It is part of what makes the species possible. The long childhood allows for an unusually large, flexible brain, for deep learning, for complex socialization, for language, memory, and culture. But it also creates a nervous system shaped from the beginning by one central expectation: someone must be near. That expectation is not abstract. It is built through rhythm, warmth, touch, smell, heartbeat, milk, voice, gaze, repetition. A child does not initially understand care as a social arrangement or as moral obligation. Care is simply the structure of reality. The body settles because another body is present. Distress rises because that pattern has broken. In this sense, the earliest roots of loneliness may not lie in adult reflection at all, but in attachment systems so old and so foundational that they precede language. Scholars still debate how precisely modern attachment theory can be projected back into deep prehistory, but the basic biological logic is difficult to escape. A species with prolonged infancy and cooperative child-rearing would have evolved especially strong sensitivity to separation. The child who notices absence quickly has a better chance of survival. The child who protests loss, cries out, searches, clings, and calms when caregivers return is not fragile by accident. Those reactions are adaptive, but over immense spans of time, adaptations can deepen into emotional inheritances. This may be why loneliness feels, even in adulthood, strangely primitive. It often carries the body before the mind can explain it. Restlessness rises, sleep changes, appetite changes. Attention narrows around signs of response and rejection. Silence becomes difficult to bear. None of this belongs only to modern psychology. These reactions likely stand on much older foundations, laid down when the human child first learned that separation means danger. The adult who sits in a crowded room feeling abandoned is not literally reliving infancy, but the underlying architecture may be related. What begins as dependency becomes a lifelong sensitivity to social presence and social loss. In prehistoric life, this attachment system would have been reinforced constantly. Human infants and children are not raised in sealed domestic interiors, but in exposed worlds where protection depends on immediate access to caregivers and the wider group. A child in a mobile foraging band is carried, watched, passed among trusted hands, corrected, soothed, and physically integrated into collective movement. The body learns community before it learns self-sufficiency. The child sleeps in proximity, wakes in proximity, travels in proximity. Separation, therefore, does not register as mere distance. It registers as rupture in the pattern that makes safety possible. Even brief absences can provoke intense distress because the developing nervous system is calibrating itself against presence. If the calibration becomes unstable, fear takes over. This matters for the deeper history of loneliness because the human emotional world does not start from neutrality and slowly add attachment later. It starts from attachment. The self emerges inside it. A child becomes a person not in isolation but in response to repeated care, repeated mirroring, repeated reassurance that the world contains recognizable others who can be counted on. Through this process, the child begins to form inner expectations when afraid. Someone comes when hungry. Someone responds when overwhelmed. Someone helps bring the body back into calm. These expectations are not merely useful habits. They become part of how reality is understood. No single explanation fully accounts for the immense complexity of early human development, but what survives in the record suggests prolonged caregiving, cooperative breeding, and shared child rearing all played central roles. In other words, human emotional life is formed from the beginning in a field of relationships. Cooperative breeding is especially important here. Many researchers argue that human children are not shaped only by one mother-child bond, but by a wider system involving fathers, siblings, grandparents, and other group members. This broader care network may have made human social intelligence unusually rich. The child must learn multiple faces, multiple voices, multiple patterns of trust. That expands the social mind early, but it may also complicate loneliness. The child is attached not just to one person, but to a living web. To lose one bond hurts. To lose the surrounding network is even more destabilizing. In times of illness, migration, conflict, or death, prehistoric children may have experienced profound emotional dislocation not because they were alone in an absolute sense, but because the recognizable pattern of care fractured around them. A lesser known but revealing aspect of childhood separation is that it teaches time. For a very young child, absence does not unfold as a measured interval. It can feel total. The caregiver who leaves may as well have disappeared into another world until they return. Gradually, with development, children begin to tolerate delay, hold others in mind while they are gone, and trust in reunion. This is a remarkable psychological achievement. It depends on memory, expectation, and repeated evidence that loss is often temporary, but it also creates the conditions for a more adult loneliness. Once the mind can hold the absent person internally, it no longer ceases to relate to them during separation. It continues waiting. It continues imagining. It continues needing. The emotional world grows more stable, but also more exposed. A being who can remember the caregiver while alone can suffer the caregiver's absence more durably. In deep prehistory, such developmental thresholds would have mattered enormously. The child old enough to understand delay but not old enough to master fear lives in a particularly charged emotional world. A foraging party departs, and the child tracks its absence. Night falls, and one familiar figure has not yet returned. An injury alters who carries whom. A death removes a source of touch, attention, or recognition that no other member of the group can quite replace. Here loneliness begins to widen beyond raw panic. It becomes longing. It becomes searching not only with the eyes, but with memory. It becomes the ache of expecting a specific presence and receiving none. This childhood foundation may also explain why loneliness is so often tangled with shame and self-blame later in life. Children are egocentric in the technical sense that they often experience events in relation to themselves before they can fully understand external cause. A withdrawal of warmth, a caregiver distracted by grief, a change in social attention, all can be felt as something that has happened to the child because of the child. Scholars still debate how these processes would have played out under Paleolithic social conditions, and we should be careful not to over-psychologize the distant past. Yet the underlying logic remains strong. A creature whose survival depends on adult attention is highly motivated to monitor signs of approval, irritation, exclusion, and return. That monitoring does not disappear in adulthood. It matures into the subtle and often painful human sensitivity to being left out, overlooked, replaced, or no longer chosen. The parental bond, then, may be one of the oldest training grounds for loneliness, not because prehistoric caregivers were cold or neglectful, but because attachment itself creates vulnerability. The more vital the bond, the more intense the cost when it is interrupted. This is true in mammals broadly, but in humans it is elaborated by longer childhood and richer cognition. A human child can grow attached not only to comfort but to routines, symbols, shared places, and emotional meanings. A particular voice before sleep, a particular hand on the shoulder, a particular person who knows how to calm fear when that person dies or disappears. The child loses not just practical care, but an entire way of organizing reality. It is difficult to imagine a more ancient seed of loneliness than that. And yet childhood attachment is not only the origin of pain, it is also the origin of empathy, trust, and the ability to remain connected inwardly even when physically apart. Secure attachment allows a person to carry others inside the mind as stable sources of comfort. In that sense, the same system that makes loss hurt also makes love durable. Early humans could endure separation precisely because bonds were strong enough to survive temporary absence. The child learns that someone can be gone and still belong. That lesson is foundational for adult life in mobile groups, where people constantly leave and return. But the lesson has limits. It works until return fails. Then the mind built for reassurance encounters a void it cannot easily revise. There may also be an evolutionary reason why the cries of infants and the grief of adults feel, in different ways, so piercing. Both are signals designed to protect connection. An infant's distress summons care. An adult's loneliness may once have helped pull them back toward group bonds before isolation became lethal. From this perspective, loneliness is not originally a defect, it is a warning system. But warning systems become torment when the situation cannot be repaired. The orphaned child cannot call a dead parent back. The bereaved adult cannot restore the lost companion. The exile cannot simply reattach to the group that has rejected them. In those moments, the ancient machinery of attachment keeps sounding long after action is possible. This is perhaps why human beings so often try to soften loneliness through substitutes that echo early care touch. Shared stories, repetitive song, rhythm, ritual. Objects carried close, symbols of belonging, the simple reassurance of sleeping near others. These are not arbitrary comforts. They work because the nervous system was formed in dependence and remains responsive to signs of co-presence. A necklace from a loved one, a grave visited repeatedly, a remembered phrase. A lullaby carried into adulthood all may function as extensions of attachment across absence. What later becomes culture may rest partly on this very old effort to keep human connection emotionally available when physically interrupted. So the hidden beginning of loneliness may lie, in large part, in the nursery of prehistory in arms, in loss, in the learned expectation that another being should be there when fear rises. The child teaches us something the adult often tries to hide. Loneliness is not simply an intellectual realization that one is separate. It is bodily protest against unshared vulnerability. It is the feeling of an organism built for co-regulation discovering that, for a time or forever, regulation must happen alone. From there the rest of the story unfolds almost inevitably. Once attachment is deep enough, humans begin carrying one another inwardly even in absence. And when minds capable of symbol and memory start trying to preserve those invisible bonds, They leave traces behind beads worn close to the skin, pigments applied with care, objects kept not for utility alone but because they stand in for someone, somewhere, something no longer present, out of attachment, fear, and longing. The first symbols of missing presence begin to emerge. By the time humans begin making objects that seem to mean more than they do, something important has already changed in the species. A tool has a purpose that can be seen at once. It cuts, scrapes, pierces, pounds, or carries. Its value lies largely in what it does to the material world. But a bead, a pigment mark, an ornament worn long after it has ceased to be merely decorative, or an object carried beyond obvious practical need belongs to a different category. It still exists in the physical world, yet part of its purpose lives elsewhere, in the mind that invests it with memory, identity, attachment, or association. This is one of the quiet revolutions of human prehistory. Things begin to hold absences, and once they do, loneliness gains a new companion symbol. The earliest evidence for symbolic behavior is debated in detail, and rightly so. Archaeologists are careful because it is easy to project modern sentiment onto ancient artifacts. A perforated shell may be ornament, exchange item, signal of status, or all three. Ochre may be practical in some contexts and symbolic in others. An incised pattern may be decoration, notation, habit, or something with ritual meaning now forever beyond recovery. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the appearance of symbolic culture across different populations and time periods. Yet what survives in the record strongly suggests that by the Middle Stone Age and Upper Paleolithic, at the latest, humans are increasingly using objects not only to manipulate the world, but to represent relationships within it. That shift matters deeply for the history of emotion. A bead worn close to the body is never only a bead, even if it begins as display, affiliation, or exchange. It soon enters the intimate geography of the self. It touches skin. It moves with the person through daily life. It may be recognized by others as belonging to a group, a place, a kin line, or a particular life stage. It may be made by one person and given to another. It may carry traces of a journey, a friendship, a pairing, a promise, or a loss. None of this can be proven in every case, and caution is essential. Still, once humans begin assigning social meaning to portable objects, those objects become capable of bridging absence. They allow the individual to carry the group in miniature, to hold belonging in the hand or on the body when the full social field is not physically present. That may be one of the earliest cultural responses to loneliness, not a cure, but a buffer. An ornament says I belong somewhere. I am linked to others. I carry signs that outlast the moment. In mobile societies especially, such objects may have served as visible tokens of affiliation across shifting camps and repeated separations. A person returning after days away does not arrive as a blank body. They arrive wearing continuity. Others can read it. The wearer can feel it. In that sense, symbolic objects may help stabilize identity in a species increasingly vulnerable to emotional dislocation. The more the mind learns to miss, the more culture may learn to preserve. Ochre is especially evocative in this regard. It appears across wide spans of prehistory and across many contexts, from body treatment to object coloring to possible ritual use. Because it is so versatile, its meaning remains elusive, but that is part of the point. Ochre is useful not only materially but emotionally because it transforms surfaces. It marks. It renders something visible as significant. Applied to bodies, objects, or places. It says that this thing is not ordinary now. It has been brought into a human system of attention and care. In funerary settings, the implication can be especially powerful. The dead body is being handled not simply as remains, but as a continuing social fact. Loneliness, grief, and symbolic marking may therefore be entangled earlier than we can ever fully document. The living seem increasingly unwilling to let absence pass without trace. There is a lesser-known detail in some discussions of personal adornment that matters here. Many early ornaments come from materials sourced at a distance, including marine shells found far inland or stones transported across significant terrain. This does not automatically mean sentimental attachment. Of course, trade, mobility, and status signaling all offer plausible explanations, but distance itself can become meaningful. An object from elsewhere can bind a person to a place not presently inhabited, or to people not currently near. It can serve as portable geography, a carried fragment of another world. In a mobile species with deepening memory, that portability is emotionally potent. To wear distance is, in a sense, to refuse complete separation from it. This may help explain why symbolic culture so often flourishes alongside expanding mobility and social complexity. As human groups range farther, meet more people, lose sight of familiar landscapes more often, and live in wider webs of alliance and exchange, the need for durable signs of continuity grows. Symbols help maintain recognition when immediate familiarity fails. They help preserve group identity when camps disperse. They help the individual feel legible even in uncertain company. And they may do something even more intimate. They allow someone to hold on to a particular relationship after direct presence has ended. A pendant made by a dead mother, a shell associated with a first partner, a pigment pattern once worn by one's group, all could become emotionally charged in ways archaeology can rarely recover. Scholars still debate how personalized these meanings would have been in deep prehistory, but it would be surprising if symbolic objects never became vessels for longing. The human hand seems especially drawn to this work. To touch an object is to reinforce memory. Repeated handling polishes surfaces, wears grooves, smooths edges. Some artifacts show signs of prolonged close use that exceed straightforward utility. Again, interpretation must remain cautious. But from a psychological standpoint, it is difficult not to notice how readily humans invest touchable things with absent people. Even in much later societies, objects become anchors for grief because they remain when bodies do not. In prehistory, where written records do not yet preserve names and voices, portable symbols may have done some of that preserving in material form. A person gone from camp might still be present in an item kept close, an ornament not discarded, a tool never reassigned. Absence begins to have artifacts. This is also where symbols may start to shape the internal world more actively. Once humans can use objects to stand for belonging, memory, or missing presence, they no longer rely only on direct social contact to regulate emotion. They can evoke connection through signs. That is a profound cognitive achievement. It extends attachment across time and distance. But it also means absence becomes more consciously structured. A person can now sit alone and look at something that represents what is gone. The symbol soothes and sharpens at once. It offers continuity, and it confirms loss. This double effect may be one reason symbolic culture expands with such intensity once it appears. Humans need it because they are becoming creatures who cannot bear for important things simply to vanish. Body marking may have served a similar role, whether through pigment, ornament, scarification, or other now poorly preserved practices. The body can become a social surface carrying signs of relation. These signs announce identity outwardly, but they also remind inwardly. A person marked as belonging to a lineage, age cohort, or ritual category carries connection on the skin itself. In times of separation, that marking remains. One does not stand entirely alone because the body has been made into a record of affiliation. This is not only social signaling, it may also be emotional reinforcement, a way of keeping the human web materially present even when companions are absent. What survives in the record suggests that symbolic behavior is cumulative. A few objects appear, then more patterned use, then broader integration into burials, art, and social display. That accumulation mirrors the cumulative nature of loneliness itself. As human emotional life deepens, so too do the means of managing it. Beads, pigments, ornaments, and curated objects become part of the species' strategy for holding absence in workable form. No single explanation fully accounts for why one shell is pierced and worn while another is discarded, or why one stone is carried farther than practical need demands. But across many sites and many generations, a pattern emerges. Humans are making the invisible tangible. This may be one of the most important thresholds in the whole story. To feel loneliness is one thing, to create material forms that answer it is another. With symbol, the species begins building bridges between inner life and outer world. Memory leaves the mind and enters matter. Attachment leaves immediate contact and enters portable signs. The dead leave bodies and remain in objects, marks, and places. Even the living can be partially preserved this way. A lover far away, a child grown and departed, a lost band split by migration, a mother dead in winter, all may continue to exert force through things that stand in for them. This is not yet literature, religion, or monumentality in the later sense. It is something older and more intimate, the first human habit of refusing disappearance. And still, there is a limit to what symbols can do. They preserve connection, but they cannot restore touch. They hold memory, but they do not answer back. A bead can stand for belonging, but it cannot laugh, teach, forgive, or return from the dead. That limit matters. The more humans create signs of missing presence, the more clearly they may feel the difference between sign and living relationship. Symbols can therefore deepen loneliness even as they soften it. They make absence visible. They make longing durable. They keep important bonds alive, but in a form that constantly reminds the mind of what has been reduced to trace. Perhaps that is why the next great leap in human expression matters so much. Once the hand is capable not only of carrying tokens, but of leaving itself behind directly. Once images appear on stone and walls deep in the earth, the human relationship to absence changes again. A bead can suggest a bond. A handprint can declare a self. A painted figure can preserve movement, memory, and presence beyond the lifespan of the body that made it. In those dark spaces where art begins to appear, the mind confronts perhaps its most startling ability yet to leave proof behind that someone was here, and to do so precisely because no one can remain forever. A hand appears on stone, and with it something almost impossible to miss. Not just skill, not just decoration, presence. A human being presses pigment around the outline of a hand or places the palm directly onto a cave wall and leaves behind the shape that touched it. The result is simple enough for a child to understand and deep enough to trouble anyone who looks at it seriously. Here was a person. Here was this body, this gesture, this instant of contact between skin and surface. The hand is gone, perhaps for tens of thousands of years, yet the trace remains. Few things in prehistory reveal the growing depth of the human mind more starkly than this. A creature that leaves such a mark is no longer living only in the immediate present, it is reaching across absence. Cave art in general presents one of the most difficult and suggestive bodies of evidence in the human story. Scholars still debate its meanings intensely. Some see hunting symbolism, some ritual action, some cosmological thought, some teaching, some trance-related experience, some layered mixtures of many purposes over time. No single explanation fully accounts for the astonishing variety of animal figures, abstract signs, hand stencils, engravings, and placements found across Upper Paleolithic cave sites. Caution is essential. These are not illustrated books with captions. They do not reveal their purpose willingly. Yet whatever else they are, they testify to a mind capable of creating images that outlast the moment and matter in spaces far removed from daily utility. That alone tells us something crucial. Humans are learning not only to think, but to externalize thought into enduring traces. The location of much cave art matters almost as much as the art itself. Some images appear in accessible areas, but others lie deep inside caves, far beyond ordinary light, where movement is difficult and orientation uncertain. To reach them often requires deliberate entry into darkness, carrying flame into twisting passages where sound changes, air cools, and ordinary reference points disappear. These are not casual settings. Even if some cave use was practical at times, many decorated chambers seem to belong to another order of experience. They are removed, enclosed, hidden. A person enters them not to make a campfire meal or sharpen a tool, but to do something that warrants effort in a place set apart. This setting transforms the emotional meaning of the marks left there. Deep cave spaces compress the human world while enlarging the unseen. Firelight flickers against uneven walls, making animals seem to move and shadows seem to breathe. Handprints and signs appear suddenly at the edge of vision. Sound echoes strangely, as if the cave itself were answering. In such an environment, image and absence become intimate companions. The person who made the mark is not present, yet the mark exerts presence. The animal painted on the wall is not alive, yet in the moving light it almost is. The cave becomes a place where the mind practices holding things that are not literally there. That capacity is central to memory, ritual, and art. It is also central to loneliness. A hand stencil, in particular, may be one of the earliest unmistakable declarations that the self can survive as trace. Scholars are careful not to impose modern individualism on Paleolithic art. A handmark may signal group membership, ritual participation, initiation, counting, identity, protection, or meanings now unrecoverable. All of that may be true in different times and places, but even stripped of interpretive ambition, the gesture remains extraordinary. The maker chooses to leave evidence of bodily presence in a durable medium. They do not merely pass through the cave, they imprint themselves upon it. That implies an awareness, however early and culturally shaped, that the self can be represented from outside. I was here can exist without the continuing physical presence of the I. This matters for the history of inner life because loneliness depends partly on such representational distance. To feel loneliness fully, one must be able to perceive oneself as a being set apart from others, a self with boundaries, continuity, and vulnerability. Cave art does not prove when this capacity begins, but it strongly suggests a mind already comfortable with representation, substitution, and durable memory. A person can make an animal stand on a wall. A person can make a hand remain after the hand is gone. A person can leave signs for others not yet present, or for a future self returning later. This is no longer mere reaction to the world. It is a deliberate intervention into time. The cave wall also invites another possibility, one especially relevant to missing presence. Art may not only represent what is seen, it may preserve what is valued. Many of the animals painted in famous Paleolithic caves are not random background creatures, but powerful, meaningful beings rendered with striking care. Why these animals? Why these places? Why this repetition? Scholars still debate. But one plausible thread is that image helps stabilize relationship. To paint is to hold. To mark is to retain. Even if the image is not personal in the narrow sense, it answers the same human need to keep what matters from vanishing completely. Once the mind becomes capable of that gesture, it is not hard to imagine similar impulses surrounding people as well as animals. Even where direct representation of humans remains rarer or more constrained. A lesser known and haunting detail is that some cave handprints may include hands of different ages, and perhaps even missing fingers or bent postures shaped either by actual anatomy, gesture, or symbolic convention. Interpretation is difficult, and every case demands care. But variability matters. It suggests participation across different members of a group, and hints that the cave is not only a stage for experts, but a social surface where presence is recorded in multiple forms. If so, the wall may have acted as a kind of communal memory, not writing, not portraiture in the later sense, but an archive of contact. Here we were, here we entered, here our bodies touched this darkness together. In emotional terms, that is powerful. A trace in a cave can continue to say we long after individual voices are gone. This collective dimension may be one of the art's earliest responses to loneliness. The cave gathers absences and turns them into visible continuities. A person entering later sees marks left by others and is no longer alone in quite the same way. The living encounter preserved gestures of the absent. The wall becomes populated by previous presence. This does not remove separation or grief, but it changes their texture. Absence becomes shared, material, legible. What survives in the record suggests that humans, by this stage, are not content merely to remember inwardly. They are building external environments that store memory and belonging outside the body. At the same time, cave art may deepen self-awareness in another direction. To leave an image is to divide experience. There is the one who acts, and there is the mark that remains. The maker can step back and look. Others can look too. In that moment, the self becomes object as well as subject. It can be witnessed, interpreted, perhaps even misunderstood. This is a subtle but profound development. The social self always exists partly in how others perceive it, and art intensifies that condition. A handprint left in darkness says not only I was here, but see me through what remains. That is a fragile kind of continuity, but it is continuity all the same. And once humans begin seeking it, the possibility of feeling unseen, unheld, or forgotten becomes even sharper. This may explain why art and loneliness are not opposites but relatives. Art emerges from abundance of mind, but often in response to fragility, the fragility of memory, of presence, of time, of relationship. A trace is needed because the moment will pass. An image matters because the living body cannot remain. The same awareness that drives someone to mark a cave wall may also make them newly vulnerable to absence. They know now, perhaps not in philosophy but in practice, that things disappear and that traces must be made if some form of presence is to endure. No single explanation fully accounts for the emotional life behind Paleolithic art, yet it is difficult to ignore how often human creativity seems bound to loss, distance, and the refusal of erasure. And there is another layer still. Deep caves are places where one is physically separated from the ordinary group environment. Entering them means leaving daylight, camp routine, and open sky behind. Even if one enters with others, the experience alters perception in ways that can heighten inwardness. Time feels different underground. Sound feels different. Orientation loosens. A reflective human being in such a space may become more aware not only of the group, but of the self in relation to hidden forces, memory, and mortality. Cave art, then, may reveal not just communal identity but contemplative experience. The evidence remains incomplete, but the placement of images in remote chambers suggests that some human beings sought out environments where the mind could confront what ordinary life kept at the edges. That confrontation likely included loneliness in its broader sense, the awareness of being a separate consciousness in a world full of other beings, all vulnerable to disappearance. A handprint on a cave wall does not proclaim loneliness directly, yet it stands very close to the emotional threshold from which loneliness becomes fully human. It says the self can leave a trace because the self cannot stay. It says presence is precious because it is temporary. It says memory must be externalized because bodies are finite. In that sense, the cave wall and the mind are part of the same story. Both become surfaces on which humans learn to keep company with what is absent. By now, the human emotional world has become dense enough to hold memory, grief, attachment, symbol, and trace all at once. But one unsettling question remains. Humans are not alone in this story. For long stretches of prehistory, Homo sapiens shares the world with other human kinds, beings close enough to resemble kin and different enough to feel strange. And when some of those others disappear, leaving one branch of humanity to continue without them, loneliness may take on an entirely new scale, not just the absence of particular people, but the absence of other human worlds beside one's own. For most of modern human history as it is usually imagined, humanity stands alone. There are people in many lands, speaking many languages, living under different skies, but they are all members of the same surviving kind. That solitude feels natural only because it is ancient enough to be forgotten. Yet for long stretches of prehistory, Homo sapiens is not alone in the world. Other humans exist beside them. Neanderthals in Western Eurasia, Denisovans somewhere farther east, known now mostly through fragments and genes, perhaps other late surviving lineages in parts of Asia and island Southeast Asia. The details remain incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact timing, range, and interaction of several of these populations. But one fact is secure. Humanity was once plural. That changes the emotional landscape in ways archaeology can only hint at. To encounter another humankind is not like encountering prey, predator, or ordinary stranger. The other is close enough to be recognizable and distant enough to be unsettling. A Neanderthal face, body, gait, and voice would not have been invisible to a Homo sapiens observer, nor comfortably identical. The same is true in reverse. These beings occupy much of the same ecological and cognitive ground. They make tools. They hunt. They care for their own. They bury, or at least deliberately place, some of their dead. They survive cold, injury, and long dependence. They are not beasts at the edge of human imagination. They are another version of being human in the world. That fact alone may have deepened self-awareness. The the self often sharpens in contrast. One becomes more conscious of one's own group, body, habits, and signs of belonging when confronted with another group close enough to compare, yet not fully merge with. Encounters between distinct human populations likely varied enormously. Avoidance, conflict, brief coexistence, exchange, mating, ignorance, curiosity, fear. No single explanation fully accounts for the whole range. The record suggests both interbreeding and replacement, both contact and long separation. But whatever form these encounters took, they would have made humanity visible to itself in a new way. A person does not merely belong to a band now. They may begin to belong to a kind. This is not to say Paleolithic people thought in modern species categories. They did not need taxonomy to experience difference. A visiting group with unfamiliar speech, faces, ornaments, or movement patterns is already enough to trigger attention. The difference with Neanderthals or other human relatives is that the contrast may have been even more difficult to classify emotionally. These were not simply foreigners. They were human enough to be legible. Their children could, in some cases, be one's children too. The genetic record makes that much clear. Homo sapiens carries traces of those ancient meetings in living bodies today. Interbreeding happened. However brief or rare it may have been in some regions, it means that contact crossed the boundary of fear often enough to become biological history. That makes the later disappearance of these other humans especially haunting. Neanderthals vanish. Denisovans, as distinct populations, vanish into fragments and ancestry. Other archaic lines disappear from the visible world. What remains is not a shared human plurality, but one surviving branch carrying faint traces of the others within itself. This loss happened slowly and unevenly, not as one dramatic final night. Climate instability, competition, demographic fragility, small population sizes, interbreeding, and geographic fragmentation all likely play roles. Scholars still debate the weight of each factor. Some emphasize environmental volatility, others stress the advantages of wider Homo sapiens networks, symbolic exchange, or more flexible adaptation. No single explanation fully accounts for the disappearance of the others, but the consequence is unmistakable. A world once inhabited by multiple human forms becomes a world inhabited by one. Would anyone at the time have felt that as loneliness the evidence cannot answer directly? No cave wall says we are the last of our kind. No burial tells us how often sapiens mourned a Neanderthal friend, feared a Denisovan stranger, or noticed that certain valleys no longer held the people once found there. Yet the possibility is difficult to dismiss entirely. Human beings are observant social creatures. They notice when a familiar neighbouring group stops returning. They notice abandoned routes, unused shelters, silent territories, and the disappearance of recurring signs. If populations that had once been intermittently encountered cease to appear, some people surely registered the change, even if they understood it only locally. One more pattern in the world had gone quiet. There is a lesser-known emotional possibility here that runs deeper than direct friendship or intergroup affection. The disappearance of other humans may have narrowed the imaginative horizon of what humanity was. When more than one kind of human exists, the category itself remains open, unstable, relational. One can live with the knowledge that being human comes in different forms. When those others vanish, that plural condition ends. Homo sapiens does not merely survive. It inherits a strange monopoly. From then on, every human face on Earth belongs broadly to the same surviving lineage. That may sound like triumph from a modern distance. It may also contain an older and more haunting undertone. A conversation has ended, and one speaker remains. Neanderthals make this especially poignant because they do not seem emotionally alien. The old caricature of the brutish half-animal has collapsed under decades of evidence. They are stockier, adapted to cold, technologically distinct in important ways, and perhaps less connected through large exchange networks than some later Homo sapiens populations. But they are also careful tool makers, hunters, probable caregivers, and perhaps mourners. What survives in the record suggests minds and social worlds substantial enough that their disappearance cannot be treated as the simple replacement of one clever ape by another. Something genuinely human was lost, even if we can no longer reconstruct its full texture. That recognition can change how loneliness is understood in the human story. Loneliness is often framed as one individual lacking company, but here it becomes civilizational in the deepest prehistoric sense. One human lineage remains after others fall silent. Their tools stop appearing, their bones stop accumulating, their local traditions stop being renewed. Only traces remain, buried in sediments and in genes carried by the descendants of those who met them. The surviving species goes on to fill the planet, but it does so alone in a way earlier humanity did not. Even if no one at the time grasped the full scope, the condition itself is real. Humanity becomes solitary at the species level. This may also help explain a persistent tension in modern humans between fascination with other minds and the impossibility of ever truly finding equals beyond ourselves. We search for intelligent life in animals, in imagined spirits, in the heavens, in machines. We tell stories of doubles, wild people, hidden tribes, ancient beings beneath the earth, gods that speak in human language, creatures almost like us but not quite. Some of that surely comes from ordinary imagination, yet perhaps part of it reflects a deeper inheritance. For most of recorded history, humans have been the only surviving humans. The category is closed, and something in the mind resists that closure. Scholars would rightly caution against projecting such speculative continuity too far. Still, it is striking how often human culture seems haunted by the possibility that we are not, or should not be, alone. There is another layer. The disappearance of other humankinds may have fed the emotional and symbolic life of Homo sapiens in more immediate ways through assimilation. The others do not always simply vanish from the world. In some cases they are absorbed into sapiens' ancestry. Their total disappearance is therefore not pure erasure, but a mixture of extinction and incorporation. That creates a strange form of missing presence. They are gone as visible peoples and still present inside the descendants of those who replaced or joined them. We know this now through genetics, not through ancient testimony, but the fact itself has emotional weight. Modern humans carry within them the remains of long-ended meetings. Loneliness, in that sense, is never complete. The other survives as inheritance, though stripped of face, voice, and independent continuity. This is perhaps the most unsettling form of absence yet encountered in the story. The dead remain in memory, the missing remain in longing, the exiled remain beyond reach, but other human worlds remain only as traces, half erased within the one lineage that continues. Their loneliness, if such a word can be stretched this far, becomes ours. We inherit a planet from which not only individuals but whole human possibilities have disappeared, and that inheritance shapes the emotional meaning of what comes next. By the time archaeology, anthropology, neuroscience, and evolutionary theory try to reconstruct the beginnings of loneliness, they are not studying a feeling in a simple or isolated form. They are studying a species built by attachment, widened by memory, deepened by grief, stabilized by symbol, sharpened by darkness, wounded by exile, and left finally as the sole surviving human branch among many once possible. The question then becomes more difficult and more urgent. What can the evidence truly show about such a feeling? And where does interpretation begin to outrun what ancient bones, pigments, burials, and genes can honestly bear? By this point, loneliness in the human story seems almost impossible to avoid. The species is deeply social, physically vulnerable, unusually dependent in childhood, increasingly reflective in thought, and capable of carrying the dead, the distant, and the missing within memory long after direct contact ends. The temptation is to say that the case is settled. Of course, early humans felt loneliness. Of course, the roots reach back into prehistory, and in broad terms, that conclusion is persuasive. But this is also the point where the evidence must be handled with the greatest discipline. Human beings are exceptionally good at reading feeling into traces, and that talent can become a liability. A burial becomes grief too quickly. An ornament becomes longing too quickly. A cave mark becomes self-expression too quickly. The ancient record is rich, but it is also silent in the most literal sense. It does not describe its own emotions. So the real challenge is not simply to imagine loneliness in the past, but to ask what kinds of evidence can support that imagination without collapsing into projection. Archaeology is the first and most stubborn source, and it comes with strict limits. It recovers behavior, not inner narration. A body carefully placed in the ground tells us that the dead were handled with intention. It does not tell us exactly what the living felt while doing so. A shell bead worn for a long time tells us that an object mattered beyond immediate utility. It does not tell us whether it carried memory, status, affiliation, or some mixture now beyond recovery. A healed injury tells us that another person likely survived through the help of others. It does not tell us whether the bond between caregiver and injured person included affection, duty, or reluctant pragmatism. Archaeology excels at showing pattern, repetition, effort, and deviation from mere necessity. It is weaker at naming emotion precisely. That weakness is not failure. It is the condition of the evidence. This is why serious interpretation often works by convergence rather than proof. One line of evidence rarely settles anything, but when several lines point in the same direction, a stronger picture emerges. Long childhood suggests deep attachment. Evidence of sustained care suggests social investment beyond immediate utility. Deliberate burial suggests the dead remain socially meaningful. Symbolic objects suggest humans preserve affiliation and memory materially. Cave art suggests the self and its traces matter across time. Genetics and population history suggest repeated rupture, disappearance, and reconfiguration in human social worlds. None of these alone can prove loneliness. Together, they make it increasingly plausible that early humans possessed the emotional architecture from which loneliness arises naturally. Anthropology adds another layer, though one that must be used carefully. No living hunter-gatherer society is a frozen survival of the Paleolithic, and scholars rightly reject simplistic attempts to treat recent foragers as direct replicas of ancient humans. All living people are modern, historically shaped, and embedded in unique circumstances. Still, ethnographic evidence can illuminate enduring features of small-scale social life, the importance of kin, the centrality of cooperation, the emotional force of exclusion, the role of shared childcare, the value of elders, the pain of bereavement, and the way landscape itself can become socially remembered. These patterns do not prove identical emotions in deep time, but they do provide a grounded comparison. They remind us that in highly interdependent social worlds, the absence of particular people is rarely a trivial matter. It is often material, symbolic, and psychological at once. Neuroscience and psychology contribute differently. They do not reach directly into prehistory, but they reveal what kind of creature the human being is. Modern studies show that loneliness is not merely a poetic state. It alters stress responses, sleep, attention, immune function, and perception of threat. Social exclusion activates brain systems closely tied to distress. Attachment shapes development from early infancy onward. Human beings regulate emotion through co-presence more than they often realize. None of this can be mapped mechanically onto Paleolithic individuals, but it does tell us something foundational. The modern human nervous system is built to depend on social bonds in ways that are ancient, deep, and bodily. If the underlying architecture is old, then some form of loneliness is likely old as well. Still, there are hard limits. One major problem is equifinality, the fact that different causes can produce similar material traces. A body buried with objects may reflect grief, ritual obligation, status display, fear of contamination, cosmological belief, or combinations of all of these. A healed injury may imply compassion, but it could also reflect mutual dependence or simple tolerance within a group that had no better option. A portable ornament may signal personal attachment, but it might also mark alliance, fertility, age, or trade. This is why scholars remain cautious. The same archaeological pattern can carry multiple emotional meanings, and those meanings may differ from one population to another. No single explanation fully accounts for any complex symbolic behavior, and the further back in time one goes, the more interpretive restraint becomes necessary. Another problem is survivorship. The record is biased toward what preserves. Stone tools survive well. Organic materials often do not. Gesture, tone of voice, lullabies, informal rituals of comfort, temporary shrines, songs of mourning, patterns of touch, and most emotional practices vanish almost completely. This means archaeology may systematically underrepresent the softer and more intimate sides of human life, the very sides most relevant to loneliness. The absence of direct evidence for certain behaviors cannot therefore be taken as evidence that the emotional world was thin. In some ways, the opposite may be true. The material record may preserve the hard shell of survival while losing much of the emotional texture that made survival bearable. There is a lesser-known methodological challenge here as well. Emotion itself is not a single thing. Loneliness can refer to acute separation distress, chronic social exclusion, grief-shaped absence, homesickness, loss of role, loss of place, or existential solitude. These do not all leave the same traces, and they may not all emerge at the same stage of cognitive or cultural development. It is therefore possible that early humans possessed some forms of loneliness long before others. Infant separation distress is likely extremely ancient. Grief over the dead may be ancient too if prolonged attachment was already in place. More reflective or existential loneliness, the feeling of being inwardly cut off even in company, may require richer symbolic life, more stable self-awareness, or more elaborate language. Scholars still debate these distinctions, and they matter. Asking when humans first felt loneliness may actually contain several separate questions. Evolutionary theory helps here by reframing what loneliness might have been for before it became what it is now. In many species, separation distress functions adaptively. It keeps vulnerable young near caregivers. It pulls social animals back toward the group. It raises the cost of drifting too far from protective bonds. In humans, This system may have been elaborated rather than invented from scratch. What changes is not the existence of social pain, but its cognitive reach. Memory extends it. Language names it. Symbol preserves it. Ritual embeds it. Reflection intensifies it. On this view, the evidence does not need to prove that early humans suddenly created loneliness out of nothing. It only needs to show that older social distress became more layered, durable, and inward as the human mind changed. That argument is stronger because it asks less of the record and aligns more closely with what is known about gradual evolution. Even so, humility remains necessary. We can say with confidence that early humans depended deeply on social bonds. We can say that attachment, care, and bereavement likely mattered enormously. We can say that the material record increasingly reveals minds concerned with a memory, presence, identity, and symbolic continuity. We can say that the biological roots of social pain are ancient, but we cannot excavate the first lonely thought as if it were a stone blade under sediment. We cannot know exactly when one individual sat by a fire and experienced separation not just as danger, but as inward ache. The evidence remains incomplete, and it probably always will. That incompleteness is not disappointing once it is understood properly. In a way, it belongs to the subject. Loneliness is among the least visible of human conditions even now. It can hide in a crowded room, inside a marriage, beneath competence, within ritual, beneath speech. It leaves few direct traces because much of its force lies in the gap between outer appearance and inner feeling. The prehistoric record, for all its silence, may therefore be oddly appropriate. It shows us the structures around loneliness, the conditions that make it likely, the behaviors through which humans answer it, and the material signs that absences mattered. It stops short of confession. But confession may never have been necessary to make loneliness real. So what can the evidence really show? It can show that by deep prehistory, humans are no longer merely social animals in the simple sense. They are beings who care for the weak, invest in the dead, preserve traces, carry symbols, return to meaningful places, raise children through prolonged attachment, and live inside networks fragile enough that separation has major consequences. It can show that the human mind has become increasingly able to sustain memory and identity across absence. It can show that loneliness, in at least several of its likely forms, fits naturally into this evolving world. And it can show that our most haunting question is not unreasonable after all. The first loneliness probably was not a modern feeling dropped into the distant past. It was the gradual deepening of old social pain inside a new kind of mind. That leaves one final debate. Even if the conditions for loneliness are ancient, when does the feeling become fully human in the way we would recognize it now? Is it already there in archaic attachment and grief? Or does it require language, symbol, and reflective thought before it becomes something richer, sadder, and more enduring? The evidence can take us only so far. From there, competing explanations begin. One explanation begins very early, almost before humanity in its modern form exists. On this view, loneliness is not a late cultural invention, but an ancient biological inheritance. A refined version of separation distress carried upward from older mammalian attachment systems into the human line. The infant cries when the caregiver disappears. The young primate becomes agitated when cut off from the troop. The adult social animal suffers when bonds fracture because isolation reduces survival. Humans, according to this interpretation, do not invent loneliness so much as deepen it. The emotional core is already there long before art, ritual, or complex speech. What changes over time is intensity, duration, and the degree to which the feeling becomes wrapped in memory, anticipation, and self-reflection. This is the most evolutionarily continuous explanation, and in many ways it is the hardest to dismiss. Its strength lies in what it does not require. It does not need a sudden revolution of consciousness, nor a precise moment when emotion appears out of nowhere. It starts from well-supported principles. Humans are mammals. Mammals often form attachment bonds, and separation from attachment figures produces distress with measurable physiological consequences. Long childhood, cooperative care, and strong adult interdependence would only strengthen that system. Under this model, the earliest humans capable of sustained social bonds are already capable of loneliness in foundational form. A child separated from its caregiver feels it. An injured adult left behind feels it. A mate deprived of familiar company feels it. The feeling may not yet be narrated inwardly in the way a modern diarist could narrate it, but the organism experiences the wound all the same. Yet this early biological model has limits. It explains why humans are vulnerable to separation, but not necessarily why human loneliness becomes so symbolically and existentially rich. It can describe the roots of distress, but it struggles more with the later forms in which a person feels alone even among others, or grieves not just a missing body but a lost future, a vanished role, or an absence that has become part of identity. Social mammals can suffer when isolated. Humans can meditate on isolation, anticipate it, reinterpret it, ritualize it, and make art from it. The biological continuity model gets us to the threshold. It may not fully explain what happens after the threshold is crossed. That is where the second explanation enters, and it places far more weight on cognition. According to this view, loneliness becomes distinctly human only when the mind develops the ability to hold absent persons internally with enough stability and complexity that separation becomes reflective rather than immediate. Memory must become more layered. Anticipation must become more far-reaching. The self must become more coherent as an inner point of reference. Under this interpretation, ancient attachment distress is real, but it is not yet loneliness in the fullest sense. It is only once the mind can say, in however wordless an early form, I am the one who remains without them, that the feeling becomes truly human rather than simply mammalian. This argument has considerable force because it accounts for the depth and strange persistence of human loneliness. Humans do not only miss company in the present moment, they compare present absence with past presence and imagined futures. They miss specific conversations not yet had, routines not yet repeated, reconciliations that will never occur. They feel the outline of another person inside their own sense of self. Such experiences seem to require a representational mind of considerable sophistication. On this view, language may not be absolutely necessary, but something close to language, or at least to stable symbolic thought, becomes central. A being must be able to organize time and relationship mentally before loneliness becomes what we would readily recognize. The weakness of this reflective model is that it can draw the line too sharply. Human evolution rarely works by clean boundaries. There is no obvious point at which older social pain stops and fully modern loneliness begins. More likely, different layers accumulate gradually. An infant's separation distress, a hunter's fear at being lost, a mourner's ache after burial, a solitary thinker's awareness of inner isolation. These may belong to the same family of emotion without being identical in complexity. Scholars still debate where one should place the strongest emphasis, Some favor continuity from older mammalian attachment systems. Others place more weight on symbolic cognition, language, and the emergence of a richly self-aware mind. The evidence remains incomplete because both positions illuminate different parts of the truth. A third explanation shifts attention away from the individual mind and toward culture. In this view, loneliness becomes fully human only when social life is thick enough in symbols, obligations, ritual expectations, and shared narratives that absence can be interpreted in culturally specific ways. The raw pain of separation may be ancient, but culture teaches people what that pain means. It decides whether a dead person remains socially active, whether exile is spiritual contamination or practical punishment, whether dreams of the absent matter, whether certain objects stand for enduring bonds, whether being alone is shameful, sacred, dangerous, or transformative. On this account, loneliness is never purely biological or purely cognitive. It is shaped by the worlds humans build together. This cultural model has a great deal to recommend it, especially once symbolic objects, burials, body marking, and cave art begin to appear in the record. A society that treats the dead as continuing members of memory will produce one kind of loneliness. A society that emphasizes group cohesion through ornament and ritual will produce another. A society that values solitary vision or initiation may frame some forms of aloneness positively, while still fearing abandonment. What survives in the record suggests that by the later phases of prehistory, human groups are already doing some of this shaping. They are not simply feeling, they are organizing feeling. They are embedding absence in practices that make it intelligible. Still, culture alone cannot be the full answer. Culture works on a nervous system already primed for attachment and already capable of social pain. It gives form to what biology and cognition have made possible. So perhaps the strongest explanation is not one theory defeating the others, but a layered account in which all three are true at different depths. The oldest level is biological separation hurts because social mammals depend on bonds. The next level is cognitive. The pain deepens as memory, anticipation, and self-awareness allow the mind to sustain absence inwardly. The third level is cultural symbols, rituals, stories, and norms organize that inward pain into shared meaning. Loneliness, under this model, is ancient in root, increasingly human in structure, and culturally elaborated in expression. A lesser-known point in this debate concerns language specifically. Some scholars have wondered whether complex emotion can really exist in fully human form before language makes it nameable. The idea is tempting, but probably too strong. Emotional life does not wait for vocabulary. Infants, after all, feel distress before they can speak, and adults often struggle to name what they feel even with a full lexicon available. Yet language likely transforms loneliness profoundly by making absence discussable, repeatable, and socially shareable. A person can be spoken of while absent. A promise can be made to return. A death can be narrated. A memory can be retold. A wound can be described and redescribed until it becomes part of a life story. Language may not create loneliness, but it likely stabilizes it, extends it, and ties it more tightly to identity. This helps explain why no single moment of origin will ever satisfy. Ask when humans first felt loneliness, and one can answer in several valid ways. If the question means when separation first caused deep distress, the answer lies far back in the evolutionary foundations of attachment. If it means when a hominin mind first held absent others in memory strongly enough for loss to endure inwardly, the answer is later, though still very ancient. if it means when loneliness became culturally recognizable through ritual, symbol, and reflective meaning, the answer is later still. The debate persists because the emotion itself is layered. It contains remnants of infancy, mammalian dependence, social cognition, grief, symbolism, and self-conscious time. There is also the possibility that loneliness intensifies not just with cognitive complexity, but with social success. The more elaborate and reliable human cooperation becomes, the greater the shock when it fails. This would mean loneliness grows strongest, not at the margins of human development, but near its achievements. The better humans become at mutual care, the more devastating care's withdrawal becomes, the richer memory becomes, the more loss echoes, the more stable social roles become, the more painful it is to lose one's place, the more symbols preserve attachment, the more durable longing becomes. Under this view, loneliness is not the residue of primitive weakness. It is the shadow cast by the very capacities that make humans exceptionally adaptive. That may be why modern loneliness can feel both deeply animal and painfully abstract at once. One part of it belongs to ancient survival systems. Another belongs to the mind that can imagine futures and revisit absences endlessly. Another belongs to the cultural inheritance that teaches what bonds should mean and how their failure ought to be felt. Prehistory likely contains all of these in earlier forms. The proportions differ, the language differs, the rituals differ, but the overall trajectory is the same. Human beings do not become lonely only when civilization appears. They become increasingly capable of loneliness as they become increasingly capable of being human. So the competing explanations are less like rival armies than like different lights cast on the same landscape. Biology explains why separation hurts. Cognition explains why it lingers and deepens. Culture explains why it takes particular shapes and leaves particular traces. None of these alone is sufficient. Together, they make the hidden beginning of human emotion easier to see, even if never with complete certainty. Loneliness is old enough to be rooted in the body, new enough to be transformed by thought, and social enough to be shaped by every collective world humans have ever built. Which brings the story to a difficult turn. If loneliness begins as a useful warning, a way of driving vulnerable creatures back towards safety and connection, how does it become one of the heaviest forms of suffering humans know? Somewhere along the long road from adaptation to consciousness, the signal grows larger than its original function. It stops being only a guide and becomes, at times, a burden in its own right. At its origin, loneliness is probably not meant to destroy. It is meant to warn. In evolutionary terms, that makes immediate sense. A vulnerable infant separated from caregivers is in danger. An adult cut off from the group is in danger. A social species whose members drift too far from one another becomes easier to kill, easier to starve, easier to forget. Under such conditions, a painful internal signal pushing the individual back toward connection is not a flaw. It is protection. It is as practical, in its own way, as hunger or thirst. Hunger says the body is running low on fuel. Loneliness may once have said the social body is running low on safety. The feeling hurts because it has to matter. This interpretation helps explain why loneliness is so persistent across human life. It is not some decorative emotional luxury that appears only in rare or reflective people. It belongs to the deep operating system of the species. The child cries when left alone. The adolescent suffers exclusion from peers. The adult fears rejection, abandonment, and the cooling of important bonds. The elder feels the shrinking of the social world with each death. These are different experiences. but they may all draw on one ancient mechanism, the pain of disconnection, as a survival signal. What survives in the record suggests that for most of prehistory, this signal would have been highly adaptive. Separation often did mean increased risk. To feel its cost quickly and sharply was, in most situations, useful. The problem begins when a signal designed for acute correction enters a mind capable of prolonging it. Hunger can usually be answered with food, thirst can usually be answered with water, but loneliness in a reflective social being is not always resolved by immediate reunion, and even when reunion occurs, it may not repair what has changed. The dead do not return, the exiled may not be welcomed back, the injured may never recover their former place. A bereaved parent remains bereaved even in company. A widow can sit within the group and still feel the shape of one vanished person more vividly than the presence of everyone else. At that point, the signal has outrun its original design. It still demands restoration, but restoration is impossible or incomplete. This is one of the cruelest developments in the history of human emotion. The very mechanism that once helped keep fragile bands together becomes a source of long-term suffering when the social world becomes complex enough and memory durable enough that loss cannot simply be corrected. Loneliness then stops functioning only as an alarm and starts behaving like weather inside the mind. It lingers, it colours perception, it changes sleep, vigilance, appetite, trust, and interpretation of silence. Modern neuroscience has shown how loneliness can heighten sensitivity to threat and social ambiguity, and while such findings cannot be transferred mechanically into prehistory, they fit the broader logic. A body built to detect dangerous disconnection may remain on guard even when no practical action remains. The warning keeps sounding in an empty landscape. This lingering quality may have emerged gradually as human social life deepened. In small, mobile groups, separation is often concrete and situational. Someone is missing, someone has died, someone has been left behind, someone has changed status. But as symbolic life expands, humans become capable of losing not only people, but versions of the future. A person can feel lonely because the child they expected never survives, because the mate they imagined aging beside disappears, because the band splits and the social world that once gave structure to every day can no longer be restored. Loneliness now attaches not only to bodies, but to imagined continuities. This is where suffering intensifies. The signal is no longer pointing to one recoverable relationship. It is pointing toward an altered world. A lesser known but important consequence of this is that loneliness can become self-reinforcing. A person feeling cut off may become more vigilant, more withdrawn, less trusting, more likely to perceive threat or indifference in uncertain interactions. In harsh environments, some of this may once have been protective, but it can also make reconnection harder. Even in small groups, grief, injury, humiliation, or prolonged absence may change the way others respond and the way the sufferer reads them. Scholars still debate how far such feedback loops can be inferred in ancient settings, yet the general principle likely has deep roots. Human social pain is not passive, it shapes behavior, and shaped behavior can prolong pain. This may be why loneliness occupies such an unusual place among emotions. Fear often sharpens action. Anger often seeks discharge. Grief, though enduring, has a clear object. Loneliness is stranger. It can be intensely specific and frustratingly diffuse at the same time. It may attach to one absent person, or to a whole missing way of life, or to the feeling of not being fully recognized even by those nearby. The more complex human societies become, the more forms this suffering can take. but its prehistoric roots still show through. Beneath the subtler versions lies the original bodily truth: to be cut off from one's people has always carried danger, and the body never entirely forgets that. Yet the story is not only tragic. Because loneliness hurts, humans respond to it creatively. They build practices that reduce its force. They sleep close. They share grief. They create rituals around death. They mark bodies and objects with signs of belonging. They tell stories that keep the absent socially alive. They care for children not only with food, but with rhythm, touch, and recognition. They preserve places where memory can gather. In this sense, loneliness may have acted not only as suffering but as pressure toward culture. The more painful disconnection became, the more necessary it was to invent forms of connection that could survive distance, danger, and mortality. The signal drives not only reunion, but invention. That invention, however, carries a paradox. The more humans build systems to protect connection, the more devastating it becomes when those systems fail. Ritual makes death meaningful, but also unforgettable. Memory preserves loved ones, but keeps them emotionally present after loss. Symbol gives continuity, but constantly reminds the sufferer of what has been reduced to trace. Culture softens loneliness, and at the same time it can deepen it by expanding the emotional weight of what is gone. No single explanation fully accounts for this contradiction, but it appears again and again across the human story. The things that make absence bearable also make it harder to dismiss. This is especially true once identity becomes strongly relational. In deep prehistory, a person likely knows themselves through kin ties, role, shared labor, place, and repeated recognition by others. When these links fray, suffering is not limited to missing companionship. The self becomes less stable. The bereaved hunter is not only without a partner, he is altered in who he is. The mother who loses a child is not only grieving an absence, she is living inside a changed identity. The exile does not merely lack shelter. He lacks the human mirror through which his personhood had been continuously confirmed. Loneliness becomes unbearable, partly because it is no longer just social deprivation. It is disturbance of selfhood. There is also a temporal cruelty to it. Human beings can outlive their own social world. In a long life, one may survive parents, siblings, companions, lovers, children, mentors, and the very landscape of belonging. This is not unique to modernity. Even in prehistory, some individuals must have lived long enough to feel the band thinning around them, the remembered dead outnumbering the living who truly knew the old stories. Such people would have carried one of the oldest and quietest forms of suffering, not being literally alone, but remaining after too much has vanished. What survives in the record can barely glimpse such lives, yet the demographic reality makes them almost unavoidable. Someone always becomes the last keeper of certain memories. From that perspective, loneliness is not merely a defect in human design. It is the cost of a design built for durable attachment in a world where nothing durable stays intact forever. The feeling begins adaptively because attachment is adaptive. It becomes suffering because attachment succeeds too well. Humans do not lightly sever bonds, do not quickly erase the dead, do not cease building identity around one another. They carry connection forward even when the world no longer supports it. That fidelity is noble in one sense and devastating in another. It allows love, kinship, continuity, and civilization itself. It also ensures that absence can wound for a very long time. So the path from survival signal to suffering is not a detour from the human story. It is one of its central developments, A pain designed to protect the group becomes entwined with memory, self-awareness, ritual, and history until it can no longer be understood merely in functional terms. It retains its ancient body, but it acquires a larger mind. And once that happens, loneliness becomes one of humanity's most revealing emotions. It exposes how dependent people are on one another, how deeply they internalize those bonds, and how difficult it is for a reflective creature to accept that not every rupture can be repaired. From here, the next step follows naturally. If loneliness hurts because humans are made to carry one another inwardly, then much of human culture may be read as an attempt to answer that pain. Kinship systems, mourning rites, shared myths, heirlooms, sacred places, and stories told across generations all become ways of resisting disappearance. Out of the suffering of absence, humans begin crafting inheritances designed to make the lost remain, if only in memory, symbol, and the lives of those who come after. Once loneliness becomes more than a passing alarm, humans begin building entire worlds against it, not worlds free of loss, because no such world has ever existed, but worlds in which loss can be carried, distributed, named, and given shape. This may be one of the deepest functions of culture when viewed from far enough away. Kinship, ritual, memory, ornament, burial, story, and placemaking all help ensure that a person does not vanish cleanly from the human field the moment they leave sight or die. The species learns, slowly and unevenly, to answer absence not only with reunion, when reunion is possible, but with continuity when it is not. That answer becomes inheritance. Kinship is among the oldest of these structures. In prehistoric life, kinship is not merely a private sentiment or a genealogical record. It is the living architecture through which care, obligation, identity, and survival are organized. A child belongs not only to a mother but to a wider web of recognition. An elder is not simply old, but a holder of remembered relations, even where descent systems are impossible to reconstruct directly. What survives in the record suggests that humans live through bonds extending beyond the individual pair. Knowledge, tools, foraging routes, ritual gestures, and status markers all pass through lines of relationship. That matters because kinship makes absence less absolute. A dead father may remain present through an uncle's teaching. A dead mother may remain present in a grandmother's handling of an infant. A deceased elder's place may be partially inhabited by those who continue their stories. Pathways and expectations. Loneliness is not erased, but it is absorbed into structures larger than one bond. This does not happen automatically. It requires active remembrance. A group must choose, again and again, to keep people socially alive after bodily disappearance. Burial is one form of that. Repetition of names, where language allows it, is another. Story is perhaps the most powerful of all. Long before writing, story lets the absent keep moving through the camp after their footsteps are gone. A dead hunter remains in the tale of a winter crossing. A lost child remains in warnings and lullabies. A split between bands remains in the explanation of why certain places are avoided or revered. What survives in the record cannot preserve the words themselves, but it strongly suggests that narrative must have been ancient, because so much of human life depends on transmitting more than technique. Story carries emotional position. It teaches not only what happened, but who belonged, who mattered, who should still be remembered. That may be one reason storytelling is so often linked with evening, firelight, and recurrence. Stories are not simply entertainment, they are emotional storage, They allow the group to revisit absences without being shattered by them each time. They take the rawness of loss and lay it into sequence, into causation, into shared memory. Scholars still debate how early, fully elaborated oral traditions can be inferred, yet there is little serious reason to doubt that prehistoric humans told stories of the dead, the missing, the heroic, the dangerous, and the beloved, a species with language, memory, and intergenerational dependence could hardly do otherwise, and once story exists, loneliness changes. The lost person no longer exists only as a whole in the present. They become a continuing figure in the collective mind. Ritual extends this further. A repeated gesture matters because it does not depend entirely on mood. It allows the living to do something when feeling alone would otherwise become formless. A burial position repeated across generations, the use of pigment, the placing of objects, the return to certain sites, the wearing of particular ornaments in moments of mourning or transition, all may help turn private ache into collective action. We should be careful here. Not every patterned act is emotional in the way modern people would assume, and archaeology can rarely isolate motive with certainty. Yet what survives in the record suggests that repeated symbolic behavior often emerges around thresholds: death, status change, identity marking, place attachment. These are precisely the points where loneliness and belonging are negotiated most intensely. Ritual does not make absence disappear. It makes it bearable by making it shareable. Place is just as important as practice. Humans do not only remember people, they remember where people were. A shelter where generations returned, a ridge associated with a death, a cave holding old handprints, a route tied to ancestral movement, all become emotional anchors in the landscape. The prehistoric world is not a blank map crossed by resource-seeking bodies. It is a remembered terrain thick with human residue. A person walking through such a landscape is accompanied by the invisible presence of others. The dead have sat here. The living once passed this way. A child was born near that bend in the river. A companion vanished on that slope before the storms. What survives in the record suggests that humans often revisited meaningful places, and meaning rarely comes from utility alone. The land itself becomes part of the inheritance built against loneliness. It remembers when bodies no longer can. A lesser-known and revealing point is that inheritance need not be monumental to be powerful. Modern people often imagine cultural continuity through grand architecture, inscriptions, or formal religion. But for most of human time, inheritance is smaller and more intimate. It may be a way of tying a cord, a pattern of shell wear, a gesture made before sleep, a warning repeated to children, a path taken in the same order each season, a tool form shaped according to remembered hands. These quiet continuities matter because they preserve persons through practice. The dead remain present not in portraits but in habits. To do something as they did it is, in a small but real sense, to refuse total separation. This may explain why skill transmission carries such emotional weight in human groups. Teaching is never only about efficiency. It is one of the main ways a person survives into the future. The elder who teaches the route to water or the proper angle for striking stone is passing on more than information. They are embedding themselves in the actions of others. Later, when they are gone, their motions remain distributed across the living. Loneliness may still follow their absence, but it is altered. The missing person is not absent in every sense. They continue in practiced memory, in the body techniques of descendants, in what later generations know how to do because someone once showed them. This is inheritance at its oldest and perhaps most essential human continuity written into skilled bodies. Shared myths, once they begin to stabilize, widen the same process. A group does not merely inherit techniques and kin ties, it inherits explanations about who they are, where they came from, what binds them to certain animals, places, or ancestors, and why some absences matter more than others, even if the fully developed myths familiar from later cultures are beyond what can be demonstrated for deep prehistory. The foundations are likely ancient. Humans need stories large enough to place individual loss inside wider patterns. Without them, loneliness remains too private, too arbitrary, too raw. With them, the sufferer can imagine that absence belongs to something more enduring than personal injury alone. The mother is gone, but she belongs to the line before and after. The elder dies, but the path remains theirs in memory. The split band becomes origin, not only wound. And yet inheritance is never neutral. It comforts, but it also preserves pain. To remember someone is to keep the fact of their absence active. To return to a grave is to honor and reopen. To wear a deceased person's ornament is to carry closeness and loss together. No single explanation fully accounts for why humans accept this burden so consistently, except that forgetting seems worse. The loneliness of total erasure may be more intolerable than the loneliness of continued remembrance. Better to suffer the ache of a visible absence than to permit a life to vanish without trace. This may be one of the species' defining decisions, repeated in countless forms across time. Humans choose memory, even when memory hurts. That choice shapes identity at the larger scale. Civilizations much later will build archives, temples, genealogies, epics, and monuments. But the impulse behind them begins much earlier. It begins when a small band decides that the dead still belong to the living story. It begins when an object is kept after its owner dies. It begins when children are taught not only how to survive, but whom they come from. It begins when loneliness becomes too great to bear as private sensation and is instead distributed into shared forms of remembrance. The first inheritance of absence is therefore not property, it is continuity. This continuity may be one reason humans survive so well despite repeated rupture. Populations split, climates change, people die, landscapes alter, and still something passes through, not unchanged, never untouched, but enough preserved to keep identity from dissolving entirely each time the world breaks. Loneliness teaches the need for that preservation. Every vanished person threatens to take a whole segment of the world with them. Inheritance is the answer. Keep the gesture, keep the root. Keep the object, keep the story, keep the place, keep the bond alive in transformed form. By now, the emotional arc is clear. The pain of separation did not simply wound the species, it helped generate some of its most enduring forms of social life. Humans build kinship systems, rituals, narratives, remembered landscapes, and embody traditions partly because they cannot tolerate pure disappearance. They need bridges between the living and the lost. They need ways of remaining together across time. In that sense, loneliness is one of the hidden engines of culture. And still, for all these answers, the feeling never leaves. The buried are remembered and remain buried. The stories are told and the storyteller still dies. The inheritance passes on, and each person must still face the inward fact of separateness in their own life. That is perhaps why the oldest emotional wound also remains the most familiar. It followed humans out of prehistory because nothing they built was ever meant to eliminate it entirely. The structures of memory and belonging can soften loneliness. dignify it, and transform it into culture. But they cannot erase the ancient truth that the human mind is built through others and can never be fully indifferent when others are gone. By the end of prehistory, loneliness is no longer a hidden possibility waiting to be born. It is already woven into the human condition, not in the modern literary sense, not yet as philosophy or confession, but as something older and more enduring, a pressure inside the social mind that never fully disappears because the social mind itself never stops depending on others to know where it belongs. The long road that begins with infant distress, shared firelight, burial, memory, symbol, and story does not end in mastery, it ends in inheritance. Humans carry forward a nervous system trained by dependence, a mind enlarged by absence, and a culture built partly to soften the pain of separation without ever being able to remove it entirely. That is why the feeling never left. It remains because the conditions that first produced it remain, even when the world around them changes almost beyond recognition. Humans are still born helpless. They still build the self through attachment. They still rely on recognition, closeness, and shared memory. They still suffer when bonds break. They still preserve the dead in stories, objects, places, and rituals. They still seek visible signs that they belong to someone and somewhere. Even the most modern forms of loneliness still carry the shape of these ancient arrangements. Beneath every new setting, the old structure remains. A person alone in a prehistoric camp, a widow in an early village, an exile at the edge of a kingdom, a labourer in an industrial city, a stranger in a crowded apartment, all are separated by immense differences, yet something recognisably human connects them. The body still asks the same question: where is the circle that holds me? What changes across time is not the root, but the scale and subtlety of the feeling. In deep prehistory, loneliness is often immediate, practical, tied to survival in small group life. Someone fails to return, someone dies, someone is excluded, the group splits, the familiar place is left behind, the absence is concrete. Later, as human societies grow larger and more stratified, loneliness acquires new disguises. One can be surrounded by many and still feel unseen. One can fulfill a role and still feel severed from tenderness. One can inherit a city and still long for a single vanished voice. Yet those newer forms do not replace the older ones. They elaborate them. The ancient emotional machinery remains inside the expanded human world, still sounding its warnings, still wounding where connection fails. This continuity is visible even in the body. Modern neuroscience, psychology, and medicine describe loneliness in terms of stress, hypervigilance, disrupted sleep, pain, and altered social perception. These findings are recent, but the system they describe is not. It is old enough to have travelled through glacial cold, long childhood, small band dependence, grief beside the fire, and the memory of lost kin long before writing gave such states a name. Scholars still debate exactly how far the full modern experience can be projected backward, and caution remains necessary. But the deeper pattern is hard to miss. Human beings are constituted by relation. When relation breaks, the disturbance is not superficial. It reaches into physiology, perception, and identity, because those systems grew up together. There is a revealing paradox at the center of this inheritance. Loneliness persists not because humans failed to become social enough, but because they succeeded beyond all other animals. No other species builds such elaborate structures of shared attention, long dependency, burial, teaching, symbolic continuity, remembered place, and inherited identity. No other surviving species is quite so dependent on others, not only for survival, but for the organization of the self. Humans become exceptional cooperators, exceptional mourners, exceptional storytellers, exceptional preservers of the absent. Loneliness is the shadow cast by that achievement. It follows the species because attachment follows the species. Wherever humans go, they build circles of belonging, and wherever those circles fray, the old pain returns. A lesser-known but important implication is that loneliness may also be one reason human memory is so moral. People do not simply remember the absent, they feel obligations toward them. The dead must be buried, named, honored, continued, or at least not forgotten. Children must be told who came before them. Places must retain the shape of events that mattered. Tools, ornaments, songs, and stories become more than objects or sounds. They become carriers of claim. Someone loved this. Someone used this. Someone is still present here because we keep acting as though their presence matters. That moral weight may be one of loneliness's most durable legacies. It turns memory into duty. This is also why loneliness does not disappear even when humans become more technologically powerful, more symbolically sophisticated, or more materially secure. The original problem was never only predators, cold, or darkness. Those mattered, but they were the outer pressures. The deeper issue was that the human self is never fully self-made. It forms in response, in attachment, in the mutual shaping of nervous systems and expectations. A person can learn solitude, endure it, even value it. Humans are capable of reflection, retreat, privacy, and contemplative distance. But chosen solitude is not the same as abandonment, bereavement, invisibility, or exclusion. The old distinction still matters. To be apart by choice may restore. To be apart without belonging can still wound in the same ancient places. That may be why so much of human culture continues returning to the same themes: lost companions, vanished homes, dead parents, children searching, exiles wandering, empty rooms, last survivors. These are not recurring motifs by accident. They are variations on one of the species' oldest recognitions that being human means needing others in ways the mind can never fully outgrow, and that time guarantees some of those others will disappear. Story returns to these wounds because they are foundational. Art returns to them because trace is one of the few tools humans have against erasure. Ritual returns to them because repetition can hold what explanation cannot. Love returns to them because the bond that protects against loneliness is the same bond that makes its loss unbearable. In this sense, the hidden beginning of human emotion is not hidden because it is rare. It is hidden because it is so foundational that later people mistake it for background. They assume loneliness is a private misfortune, a modern epidemic, a side effect of cities or screens or migration or changing custom. Those things can intensify it, certainly, but the deeper truth is older. Loneliness belongs to the first architecture of human becoming. It emerges when attachment becomes central, when memory becomes durable, when absence becomes structured, when the dead still remain socially active, when the self begins to know it cannot be whole without others and cannot keep others forever. It is ancient because humanity itself is anciently relational, and that may be the final reason the feeling never left. It is not an error in the species waiting to be corrected. It is part of the cost of being a creature whose life exceeds the body's immediate boundaries. Humans do not stop at skin. They extend into one another through care, expectation, grief, imitation, memory, and story. A child carries a parent inwardly. A lover carries the beloved. A group carries its dead. A descendant carries an ancestor's movements as a hand. A people carry vanished worlds in ritual and place. Because human life extends this way, absence always does more than remove a body. It tears at an invisible fabric that was already shared. So when asking when humans first felt loneliness, the answer may be quieter than expected. It did not begin at the moment someone named it. It began when social pain deepened into inward life, when separation stopped being only external and became part of consciousness, when the missing person remained active in memory, when the self was shaped enough by others to feel their absence as alteration of reality. From that point on, the feeling did not belong to one age or one culture. It belonged to the species, and the reason it still survives now, after all the worlds humans have built, is the same reason it first appeared on cold ground under dark skies long ago. People are never only themselves. They are made in company, steadied in company, remembered in company. Every human life begins held by others, and every human culture is, in one way or another, an answer to the fear of losing that hold. Loneliness endures because belonging endures, and because belonging is always fragile. The first humans discovered that truth without writing it down. Everyone since has lived inside its echo. In the end, the first loneliness is not a dramatic invention waiting for a date. It is more like a dim light slowly appearing inside the human mind, growing brighter as memory grows deeper, as attachment grows stronger, and as absence becomes something a person can carry long after the moment itself has passed. It begins somewhere in that long prehistoric dark when being apart stops meaning only danger and starts meaning ache. Not just the risk of death on an open plain, but the inward knowledge that someone should be here and is not. From there, an entire human world unfolds around that wound. The camps vanish, the footprints disappear, the fires go cold, the names are lost. Most of the people who first felt anything like loneliness leave behind no monument, no carved sentence, no record that can tell us exactly what they feared when the night deepened or what they carried after the dead were buried. Yet in another sense, they left evidence everywhere, in the care given to the injured, in the bodies placed deliberately into earth, in the pigments, the beads, the handprints, the remembered places, the stories that must have been told because there was too much to lose in silence. All of it suggests the same quiet truth. Humans became the kind of beings who could not let one another vanish easily. Perhaps that is why this feeling still moves through the species with such force. It is not separate from human greatness. It is tied to it. The same mind that learns to remember, to imagine, to grieve, to love, to symbolize, to inherit, also learns how deeply it depends on other minds beside it. Loneliness remains because connection remains, and because every bond, however strong, lives under the shadow of distance, death, change, and time. So the story does not end with the first lonely human sitting apart from the band. It continues in every age that follows, in every object kept after someone is gone, in every road that still feels haunted by the people once walked beside us, in every ritual made to keep the absent near, in every child reaching out in the dark for reassurance, in every old person carrying a world of faces no one else remembers clearly anymore. And somewhere behind all of it, still half hidden, the prehistoric landscape remains, a low fire under a vast sky, wind moving through dry grass, a few figures asleep, one place empty, beyond the circle of light, the darkness waiting, within it, the oldest human realization settling quietly into shape that to belong to others is one of the great comforts of being alive and one of the great sorrows, because nothing that precious can ever be held forever.